somewhere deep within the genetic code of millions living today, especially those whose ancestors ever touched the shores of the Mediterranean, a ghost ship is sailing. It carries a whisper of a forgotten language, the scent of cedarwood on a salt breeze, and a deep purple stain from a sea snail's secret, a color so rare it was once worth more than gold. These sailors, these merchants, these explorers built an empire of trade, not of armies, and they gave the world a gift so profound we use it every single day without a thought: the alphabet. Yet if you ask history where they came from, the answer is often a confusing shrug. They seem to materialize from the smoke and rubble of a dying world, fully formed, their sails already set for the horizon. This historical vanishing act, this sudden appearance on the world stage, is the first great mystery of the people the Greeks would later call the Phoenicians, the Phoenicians. It's a story that doesn't begin with a grand king or a founding myth, but with the collapse of civilization itself. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet comfort to know we're sharing this story across the globe. Tonight, we're going back, far back, to a time before them, to understand how the end of everything for everyone else became the beginning for them. The world before them, in the year 1250 BCE, was a glittering, interconnected place, a grand stage for the late Bronze Age. Imagine a world run by a handful of superpowers, like a geopolitical country club. There was the mighty Egyptian New Kingdom to the south, its pharaohs dripping in gold, controlling the flow of the Nile and projecting power north into the Levant. To the north, in the highlands of Anatolia, were the formidable Hittites, masters of the iron chariot and writers of the world's first known peace treaty. With the Egyptians, of course. Across the sea to the west, the palatial kingdoms of the Mycenaean Greeks flourished, their cyclopean walls guarding warrior kings whose deeds would one day echo in the epics of Homer. These great powers wrote to each other on clay tablets in a shared diplomatic language, Akkadian cuneiform, trading precious metals, luxury goods, and royal brides. It was a stable, predictable, and highly stratified world. And nestled between them, along a narrow, mountainous strip of coast in the Levant, what is now Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel, were the Canaanites. They were not a unified kingdom, but a collection of fiercely independent city-states. Ugarit in the north, a bustling cosmopolitan port; Byblos, ancient and pious, trading with Egypt for millennia; and further south, the well-harbored cities of Sidon and Tyre. These Canaanites were the middlemen, the service providers of the Bronze Age. Their ships, already crafted from the magnificent cedars that grew on the slopes of Mount Lebanon behind them, carried Egyptian grain, Hittite silver, and Mycenaean pottery. They were skilled artisans, but they were junior partners, vassals who paid tribute, usually to the reigning pharaoh. Their culture was a rich tapestry, woven with threads from their powerful neighbors, yet distinctly their own. Their chief god was El, the father of the pantheon, but it was his son, the dynamic storm god Baal-Hadad, who captured the popular imagination. His mythological battles against the sea god Yam and the death god Mot, echoing the precarious balance of their own lives between the turbulent waters and the arid lands. They were clever, industrious, and squeezed into a geographical space that forced them to look outward to the sea. Then, around the year 1200 BCE, this entire world broke. It wasn't a single event, but a catastrophic, systemic collapse. A perfect storm that historians still debate with a mix of awe and dread. The climate seems to have shifted, bringing prolonged droughts that withered crops from Greece to Mesopotamia. Famine stalked the great empires. Desperate letters, etched on clay tablets, found in the ashes of ruined palaces, tell the story. One king of Ugarit writes to the king of Cyprus, pleading for food, reporting that his lands are starving. Another tablet, found still baking in the kiln when the city was destroyed, is a frantic message from the same king, reporting that enemy ships have been sighted off the coast. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." It was the last message he ever sent. This was the era of the mysterious Sea Peoples, a confederation of migratory warriors and displaced populations set adrift by the chaos. They came in waves from the west, their origin still a source of intense scholarly argument. Perhaps from Anatolia, the Aegean, even as far as Sicily and Sardinia. They were not a unified army, but a destructive tide, toppling the Hittite Empire completely, sacking the great cities of the Levant, and burning the Mycenaean palaces to the ground. They swept down the coast, and only a monumental effort by Pharaoh Rameses III at the borders of Egypt finally turned them back. But the victory left Egypt so weakened, it would never again be a true superpower. The grand, interconnected world of the Bronze Age was shattered. Trade routes vanished. Literacy plummeted. Entire empires were wiped from memory. A dark age descended upon the eastern Mediterranean, and yet amid the wreckage, some of the Canaanite cities survived. The great northern port of Ugarit was utterly destroyed, its libraries of clay tablets buried until archaeologists uncovered them millennia later. But Byblos, Sidon, and crucially, the island city of Tyre endured. Why them? This is the open historical question, the mystery at the heart of their origin. Perhaps their geography offered protection. Tyre was an island fortress half a mile from the coast, difficult to assault without a powerful navy, which the Sea Peoples, despite their name, may have lacked in a siege capacity. Perhaps their economies, based on nimble maritime trade rather than vast agricultural surpluses, were more resilient and adaptable than the rigid palace economies of the great empires. One intriguing hypothesis suggests they didn't just fight the newcomers, but negotiated with them, absorbed them, or even formed partnerships. The Philistines, one of the most famous groups among the Sea Peoples, settled just south of them, becoming their neighbors and often their rivals. Whatever the precise reasons for their survival, the result was transformative. In the power vacuum left by the fallen giants, these surviving Canaanite coastal cities found themselves in an unprecedented position. The Egyptian and Hittite overlords were gone. The Mycenaean trade competitors were gone. The old rules no longer applied. They were alone, surrounded by the ruins of a greater age, but they were free. They had their ships, they had the timber to build more, and they had generations of accumulated knowledge of the sea. They were the survivors, the ones left standing when the world ended. And from the ashes of this catastrophe, they would begin to weave the world back together, but this time on their own terms. It was in this crucible of collapse and opportunity that the people history knows as the Phoenicians were truly born. This new freedom was born onto a sliver of earth, a place that would define their every move, their greatest triumphs, and their ultimate fate. To understand the people who would become the Phoenicians is to first walk their land, to feel the salt spray on your face and the imposing shadow of the mountains at your back. Their entire world was a long, narrow corridor, barely more than 30 miles wide, squeezed between the vast, shimmering expanse of the Mediterranean Sea and the formidable, cloud-piercing peaks of the Mount Lebanon range. This geography was not a choice. It was a destiny. It was a cradle that rocked them toward the sea, and a fortress that walled them off from the continents behind them, ensuring they would never become a great land-based empire like the ones whose ashes they were now sifting through. They were a people of the coast, a culture of the threshold between water and stone. Their front door was the sea. The Mediterranean, the Great Green, as the Egyptians called it, was their highway, their larder, and their greatest mystery. For them, it was not a barrier, but a network of liquid roads, a surface of infinite possibility. The predictable seasonal winds, the currents that flowed past their harbors, the celestial map of the stars above, these were the verses of an epic poem they learned by heart. Generations of fishermen and coastal traders had already read the moods of the water. But now, with the old imperial coast guards gone, the entire sea was an open invitation. It teemed with life, from the shoals of tuna that provided sustenance to the humble murex snail hiding in the depths, the unprepossessing creature that held the secret to a dye of astonishingly vibrant purple, a treasure they would soon learn to harvest. The sea was their future, a source of unimaginable wealth, but it was also a place of terror, of sudden, violent storms that could splinter a ship in moments, a realm of imagined monsters lurking in the uncharted depths. Every voyage was a gamble, a defiant act of faith and skill against the chaos of the waves. If the sea was their open front door, the mountains were the unbreachable wall at their back. The Lebanon and anti-Lebanon ranges rise almost directly from the coastal plain, a dramatic and beautiful barrier that sealed them off from the interior of Syria and Mesopotamia. For the great armies of the East, with their chariots and sprawling infantry, this was difficult, hostile territory. It gave the coastal cities a degree of natural protection that inland states could only dream of, a buffer against the ambitions of would-be conquerors. But it also penned them in. The fertile land on the coast was rich but limited, cut into small pockets by rocky spurs of the mountains that reached all the way to the sea. There was simply not enough arable land to sustain a large unified kingdom, or to feed a population that wasn't supplemented by trade. They could not expand east. They could not grow into a sprawling agricultural society. Their only direction for expansion, for survival, for ambition, was west, into the endless blue of the sea. Yet this mountainous wall was also their greatest gift. It was a treasure chest whose key they alone held. For up on those high slopes, in the cool, misty air, grew the legendary cedars of Lebanon. These were not mere trees. They were titans, ancient beings whose straight, strong, resinous trunks could grow to over 100 feet tall. The wood was a miracle of nature, aromatic, resistant to rot, and perfect for the keels and masts of strong seagoing ships. For millennia, these trees had been a prized luxury import for empires like Egypt, whose own lands lacked quality timber. The The pharaohs sent expeditions to Byblos to procure cedar for their temple doors and ceremonial barges. Now, in the aftermath of the collapse, these forests were entirely theirs. They possessed, in essence, the single most important strategic resource for building a maritime power in a world where everyone else's navy was at the bottom of the sea or rotting in port. This timber advantage cannot be overstated. It was the natural capital upon which their entire enterprise would be built. This unique geography naturally divided their world into a series of fiercely independent city-states, each nestled in its own harbor and controlling the valleys behind it. Traveling between these cities by land was often arduous, forcing them to take to the sea even for local journeys, reinforcing a maritime mindset. A traveler moving south along the coast would encounter a string of these urban jewels. First, Byblos, or Gubal as they called it, the oldest of them all, its stones steeped in piety and ancient history. Its identity was deeply entwined with Egypt and its primary role as the main port for the cedar trade. Further south lay Sidon, the fishery, with its superb sheltered harbor that would become a hub of industry, not just for its fishing fleets, but for its revolutionary workshops producing the world's first translucent glass. It was a city of artisans and laborers, practical and prosperous, but it was the city of Tyre, Sur in their own tongue, that was destined for greatness, largely due to its spectacular geography. Tyre was two cities in one, an old settlement on the mainland and a new, brilliantly fortified city built on a small rocky island about a half-mile offshore. This island was a citadel, a fortress that sea power alone could protect, and that land-based armies could only stare at with impotent frustration. More importantly, the island had two natural harbors, one on its northern side and one on its southern. This ingenious setup meant that no matter which way the wind was blowing, Tyrian ships could always find safe shelter and a clear exit to the sea. It gave them an all-weather, 24/7 operational capability that no other port in the Levant could match. The persistent disunity of these cities remains a quiet historical mystery. With a shared language, religion, and way of life, why did they never unify into a single Phoenician nation? The answer seems to be written into the landscape itself. The mountains that protected them from outsiders also divided them from each other. Each city was the center of its own little world, its own commercial network, its own ambitions. They were less like countrymen and more like members of the same family who run competing businesses. Sidon and Tyre, in particular, were often bitter rivals, vying for control of the same trade routes. This fiercely independent city-state mentality, born from their geography, was their great strength, allowing for flexibility and a diverse portfolio of colonies. But it was also their fatal flaw, for when the great land empires eventually rose again, they would find it all too easy to pick the cities off, one by one. Their world was a crucible, a geographic press that took the survivors of the Bronze Age, squeezed them between the mountains and the sea, and forged them into something the world had never seen before. A people destined to live on the water, to trade with everyone, and to answer to no one. From the crucible of their geography, one resource above all others defined their rebirth and fueled their audacious ambition, the great cedars of their mountains. To truly grasp the foundation of Phoenician power, one must leave the bustling, salt-caked harbors of Tyre and Sidon and make the journey inland and upward. The air changes as you ascend the steep slopes of Mount Lebanon. The humid coastal heat gives way to a cool, crisp mountain breeze, and a new scent begins to permeate everything. A clean, sharp, and deeply aromatic perfume of resin and ancient wood. This is the scent of cedar, the fragrance that, for the ancient world, was synonymous with wealth, power, and the divine. This was not just timber. It was the physical building block of their entire civilization. The green gold that grew on the slopes behind them, the cedar forests of the first millennium BCE, were unlike the small protected groves that survive today. They were a vast, primeval wilderness, a cathedral of colossal trees whose canopy would have blotted out the sun. Imagine walking among them, trunks 10 feet in diameter, gnarled bark like the skin of an ancient giant, soaring over 100 feet into the sky. Some of these trees were already ancient when the Bronze Age collapsed, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires. For the people living on the coast below, these forests were sacred, the dwelling place of the gods. To enter such a place was to walk in a holy temple, the quiet broken only by the wind sighing through the dense canopy. This deep reverence, however, coexisted with a profoundly practical understanding of the wood's value. They knew that the gods who lived in these trees had also given them a gift, a key to unlocking the world. The properties of Cedrus libani made it the most prized shipbuilding material in the entire world, a substance seemingly designed by the gods for mastering the sea. Its primary virtue was its size. The long, straight, knot-free trunks could be fashioned into single-piece keels and masts for their ships. This was a revolutionary advantage. While other cultures had to splice smaller, weaker timbers together, the Phoenicians could lay a single, massive beam of cedar as the spine of their vessel, giving it unparalleled strength and integrity to withstand the brutal stresses of the open sea. This allowed them to build bigger, faster, and more durable ships than anyone else. Furthermore, the wood was saturated with a natural aromatic resin. This oil made the timber incredibly resistant to rot, and most importantly, to the scourge of ancient mariners, the shipworm, a mollusk that could riddle a ship's hull with holes and send it to the bottom. A ship built of Phoenician cedar was not just a vessel. It was a long-term investment, a legacy that could be passed down through a family of merchants. The industry of harvesting this treasure was a monumental undertaking. Teams of lumberjacks would have ventured high into the mountains, their bronze axes ringing out in the sacred quiet as they felled the giant trees. Getting the massive logs, weighing many tons, down the precipitous, rocky slopes to the coast was a staggering feat of engineering. They likely used the power of the winter snowmelt, which turned mountain streams into raging torrents in the spring, to help wash the logs down to lower elevations. From there, teams of oxen straining at their yokes would drag them to the coastal cities. Once in the shipyards of Tyre or Byblos, the wood was meticulously worked by master craftsmen. But much of it was destined for export. For centuries, Egypt had been their best customer, and the sight of immense rafts of cedar logs, chained together and skillfully navigated by sailors in guideboats, being towed down the coast toward the Nile Delta, was a regular feature of the Levantine seascape. The most famous transaction involving this sacred wood is chronicled in the Hebrew Bible, a story that perfectly illustrates the Phoenicians' new role on the world stage. Around 950 BCE, King Solomon of the newly powerful kingdom of Israel, decided to build a magnificent temple to his God in Jerusalem. But his kingdom, rich in agriculture, lacked the fine timber and the skilled artisans to realize his vision. So he sent a message to an old friend of his father David, Hiram the Wongs, the king of Tyre. The exchange that followed was not one of a vassal to a superior, but a negotiation between two equals. Hiram, a shrewd and worldly monarch, agreed to supply all the cedar and juniper wood Solomon needed, along with the master craftsmen to work it. In return, Solomon would pay Hiram an enormous annual tribute, 20,000 cors of wheat and 20,000 cors of pure pressed olive oil. It was a perfect trade. Hiram exchanged his kingdom's most valuable natural resource for the food staples. His narrow coastal plain could not produce in sufficient quantity. This single story reveals everything. The immense value of the cedar, the Phoenicians' skill in trade and diplomacy, and their new standing as independent players, nation builders in their own right. This great enterprise, however, holds a deep and unsettling mystery when viewed from our modern perspective. The vast forests that Hiram knew are gone, victims of millennia of exploitation. The question that hangs in the quiet air of the remaining groves is about the Phoenicians' own role in this ecological story. Did they see the forests as a sacred trust, a renewable resource to be carefully managed with selective logging and replanting, ensuring their golden goose would survive for generations? Or were they, driven by the insatiable demand of the ancient world, the first to begin the large-scale deforestation of the mountains, clear-cutting the ancient trees without a thought for the future? The historical evidence is sparse, but the eventual state of the landscape suggests a story of overexploitation. It's a haunting hypothesis that the very resource that enabled their explosive growth and funded their civilization was consumed by their success. Their relentless drive to build, to trade, and to explore may have been built upon the slow, steady destruction of the sacred, life-giving ecosystem at their backs. The story of the Phoenicians, in many ways, begins with the sharp, clean scent of a falling cedar tree, the scent of both immense opportunity and perhaps of a long and tragic environmental loss. The life-giving cedar wood flowed down from the mountains to all the coastal cities, enriching the shipyards of Byblos and filling the warehouses of Sidon. But in the great game of commerce and power that was about to unfold across the Mediterranean, not all cities were created equal. One city was destined to rise above its sisters to become the undisputed center of this emerging maritime empire, a name that would be spoken with a mixture of awe, envy, and fear from the shores of the Levant to the misty coasts of the Atlantic. That city was Tyre. Its ascent was not an accident. It was a masterclass in leveraging every possible advantage, geographical, commercial, and political, to become the queen of the seas. We have already touched upon the miraculous geography of Tyre, but it is impossible to overstate its importance. Remember that the city was a dual entity, a mainland settlement, and more importantly, a fortified island citadel sitting half a mile out in the waves. This island provided a level of security that was almost absolute in an age of land-based armies. While mainland cities worried about the incursions of Aramaean tribes or the ambitions of inland kings, Tyre's rulers could sleep soundly, protected by their stone walls and the even greater wall of the sea. This security made Tyre a magnet for wealth. it became a safe deposit box for the region's capital, a place where merchants knew their investments and goods were protected. This stability, in turn, attracted the best shipbuilders, the most skilled artisans, and the sharpest merchants, creating a virtuous cycle of prosperity and talent. And then there were its two magnificent harbors, one facing north towards Sidon, the other south toward Egypt. This was Tyre's commercial superpower. A merchant fleet is useless if it's trapped in port by contrary winds, while a ship captain in a lesser port might wait for days or weeks for the weather to turn. A Tyrian captain could simply move his vessel from the windswept harbor to the sheltered one and set sail. This simple advantage doubled their efficiency, allowing Tyrian ships to spend more time at sea, making more journeys, carrying more cargo, and generating more profit than any of their rivals. Their port wasn't just a place to dock. It was a finely tuned economic engine, running day and night in all seasons. But geography alone does not build an empire. A city needs a visionary, and Tyre found its architect in King Hiram the Fern, who ascended to the throne around 980 BCE. Hiram was a man who saw the city's potential not just as a prosperous trading post, but as a great metropolis, the heart of a commercial network that could span the known world. He was a builder, an industrialist, and a master diplomat. One of his first and most ambitious projects was to physically expand his island kingdom. He ordered the narrow channel between the main island and a smaller adjacent islet to be filled in with stone and landfill, creating a larger unified land mass. On this new territory, he and his successors would build magnificent new temples to the city's patron deities. Melkart, the king of the city, a god of the sea and colonization, whom the Greeks would later equate with Heracles, and Astarte, the powerful goddess of fertility and war. These weren't just acts of piety. They were grand statements of power, stability, and wealth, designed to impress foreign dignitaries and inspire confidence in investors. Hiram's true genius, however, lay in his foreign policy. He looked at the new kingdoms of Israel and Judah rising in the hills to his southeast and sought not a threat, but an opportunity. We recall his famous deal with Solomon, trading Tyre's timber and craftsmanship for Israel's agricultural surplus. This alliance was a stroke of strategic brilliance. It secured a stable food supply for his growing urban population, neutralizing his city's primary vulnerability. It also gave Tyrian merchants secure access to the great overland caravan routes, like the King's Highway, that led south to the Arabian Peninsula, with its priceless cargo of incense, myrrh, and spices. Hiram essentially outsourced his agricultural and logistical needs to his inland partners, freeing up Tyre to focus on what it did best: shipbuilding, maritime trade, and high-end manufacturing. It was under Hiram that the first great waves of Tyrian expansion likely began, with royally sponsored expeditions pushing westward to Cyprus for its rich copper mines, and beyond to the far-off lands that held the silver and tin their burgeoning industries craved. The relationship between Tyre and its powerful northern sister, Sidon, is one of the enduring mysteries of this period. In the epics of Homer, the Phoenicians are often simply called Sidonians, suggesting Sidon's earlier prominence. Yet, by Hiram's time, Tyre was clearly the dominant power. What happened? One compelling hypothesis is that Tyre's rise involved not just peaceful competition, but aggressive corporate maneuvering, and perhaps even military intimidation. It's possible that Tyre, with its superior navy and secure fortress, forced Sidon into a junior partnership. The king of Tyre may have also adopted the title King of the Sidonians to formalize his control over the entire region, a political move to signal that Tyre now spoke for all of southern Phoenicia. Sidon remained a rich and important city, a vital industrial center, but its foreign policy and major trade initiatives were now likely dictated from the island palace of Tyre. The Queen City did not tolerate true rivals. Under Hiram and his successors, Tyre became the undisputed metropolis of its world. It was a dazzling cosmopolitan city, its harbors crowded with ships bearing the timber of Lebanon, the copper of Cyprus, the silver of Spain, the grain of Israel, the linen of Egypt, and the ivory of Africa. Its workshops hummed with activity, its warehouses bulged with exotic goods, and its temples were gilded with the profits of a global trade network. Tyre was no longer just a city on a sliver of coast. It had become an idea, a testament to the power of commerce over conquest, a symbol of humanity's ability to master the sea itself. A city like Tyre, gleaming on its island throne, is nothing without the tools to project its power and gather its wealth. The ambition of King Hiram and the skill of his merchants would have been confined to the shores of the Levant, were it not for the single most important product of Phoenician ingenuity, their ships. They did not invent the boat, but they perfected it, transforming the simple coastal vessel into two specialized, highly advanced designs that would allow them to dominate the sea for centuries. These ships were the backbone of their commercial empire and the sharp point of their naval power, the products of a relentless drive for efficiency, capacity, and speed. First, there was the workhorse, the unsung hero of their enterprise, the merchant ship. The Greeks, who saw them frequently, had a rather unflattering but accurate name for this type of vessel, the golos, meaning bathtub. The name perfectly captures its appearance and function. The golos was designed with one thing in mind: cargo. It had a wide, deep, rounded hull, sacrificing elegance and speed for sheer volume. It was built not to slice through the waves, but to sit heavily and steadily in them, its belly full of copper ingots, massive cedar logs, amphorae of wine and olive oil, and fine textiles. Power came from a single, large square sail mounted on a central mast, designed to catch the prevailing winds for long, economical journeys across the open sea. It was a slow and steady beast of burden, guided by two large steering oars at the stern and manned by a relatively small crew. A deliberate choice to maximize the space available for profitable goods. To be aboard a golos on the open sea was to feel the slow, rhythmic creak of cedar planks, to smell the strange mix of cargo, the tang of wine, the dust of grain, the brine of salted fish, and to feel profoundly small under a vast sky, a tiny bubble of commerce inching its way across an endless expanse of blue. But while the Gaulos built their wealth, it was their other creation that protected it and expanded its reach. This was the galley, and specifically, the revolutionary design they perfected, the bireme. If the merchant ship was a cargo van, the bireme was a pursuit interceptor. It was long, narrow, and shallow, designed for speed and maneuverability. Where the Golos was a creature of the wind, the bireme was a creature of human power. Its primary innovation, the one that changed the face of naval warfare and travel, was in its engine room, the rowers. The name bireme says it all. Pi for two, rem for oar. A traditional galley had one long line of oarsmen down each side. The Phoenician shipwrights, in a stroke of engineering genius, figured out how to add a second, staggered tier of rowers above the first. This innovation was transformative. It essentially doubled the ship's engine power without making the ship significantly longer or wider. A longer ship was structurally weaker and much harder to turn, while a wider ship was fatally slow. By building upwards, they created a vessel that was far faster and more powerful than any single-banked galley, yet remained agile and responsive. In the prow of this sleek vessel was its most terrifying feature: a heavy bronze-sheathed ram built into the keel at the waterline. The bireme wasn't just a boat that carried soldiers. The boat itself was the primary weapon, designed to punch a fatal hole in the hull of an enemy ship. While it carried a mast and sail for long-distance cruising, in the heat of battle, the mast would be lowered, and the ship would surge forward on the coordinated, percussive power of its dozens of oarsmen, a sea creature of wood and muscle closing in for the kill. These galleys were the guardians of the trade routes, hunting down the pirates who preyed on the slow-moving merchant tubs. They were also the vessels of exploration, their speed and independence from the wind allowing them to push into uncharted waters and make daring coastal runs. The genius of their shipbuilding was more than just design. It was in the construction itself. Phoenician ships were built using a sophisticated and laborious technique called mortise and tenon joinery. Instead of simply nailing planks to an internal frame, the planks of the hull were fitted together first, each one meticulously carved with sockets and tongues that interlocked with the planks above and below, secured with wooden pegs. This created a remarkably strong, flexible, and watertight hull, a kind of stressed skin where the shell of the ship provided the structural integrity. This method was a closely guarded trade secret, a technological advantage that made their ships more durable and seaworthy than any others on the sea. And how did they find their way across the featureless expanse of water? For journeys along the coast, they practiced what is called cabotage, navigating by landmarks, hopping from one visible headland to the next. But for their great open sea voyages, they looked to the heavens. They were master astronomers, and they were the first great navigators to master the use of Ursa Minor, the Little Bear constellation. At the tip of this constellation's tail is Polaris, the star that sits almost directly above the Earth's North Pole. While other stars wheel across the night sky, Polaris remains fixed, a reliable celestial anchor. The Greeks, learning of its importance from them, would come to call it the Phoenike, the Phoenician star. This knowledge gave Phoenician captains the confidence to sail at night and to strike out directly across open water, far from the reassuring sight of land, a capability that their competitors simply did not possess. The development of the bireme itself is a historical mystery. Was it a slow evolution or a sudden breakthrough? The most likely hypothesis is that it was a direct response to the dangers of the post-collapse world, an arms race against piracy. To protect their slow bathtubs full of wealth, they needed a shark. The bireme was that shark, an innovation that gave their navy a decisive edge and secured their control of the sea lanes for generations. Their ships were more than just transport. They were the embodiment of their character: innovative, efficient, resilient, and always looking to the horizon. The holds of Tyre's merchant ships were filled with the wonders of the known world. Heavy ingots of Spanish silver, fragrant cedar logs, intricate Egyptian linen, and fiery copper from the island of Cyprus. But among all these treasures, one commodity stood supreme, a product so valuable that it was often worth more than its weight in gold. It was not a metal, nor a spice, nor a precious stone. It was a color, a specific, breathtaking, and impossibly rare shade of reddish purple, a color that would become synonymous with power, royalty, and the divine for over 1,000 years. This was Tyrian purple, and the story of its creation is a testament to the Phoenicians' ability to turn the foulest of industrial processes into the ultimate luxury. The source of this legendary dye was not a beautiful flower or a rare mineral, but a humble and rather unprepossessing sea snail. Living in the coastal waters of the eastern Mediterranean were two particular species of predatory murex snail, the Bolinus brandaris and the Hexaplex trunculus. These creatures, armed with spiny, ornate shells, would crawl along the seafloor, but their true treasure was hidden within. Deep inside the snail's body was a tiny hyperbranchial gland, which, when the snail was threatened, or, in this case, fatally provoked, secreted a clear, slimy mucus. This mucus, on its own, was nothing special, but when exposed to sunlight and the open air, a miraculous chemical transformation began, a reaction that the Tyrian dyers learned to control with the precision of master chemists. The process of creating the dye was a notoriously unpleasant, large-scale industrial operation. The stench it produced was so overpowering that ancient writers complained about it frequently, and the dye works were, by law and by common decency, located on the downwind outskirts of the cities. First, the snails had to be harvested from the sea in colossal quantities. Fleets of small boats would lower baited baskets into the water to trap them, while divers risked the depths to pry them from the rocks by hand. The snails were then brought to the workshops, where the grim work of extraction began. The tiny creatures were crushed in stone mortars, or for larger snails, the precious gland was painstakingly removed with a small spike. These mountains of crushed snails and extracted glands were then dumped into enormous stone vats, mixed with salt water, and left to steep and putrefy under the hot Levantine sun for 10 days or more. The smell of tens of thousands of rotting mollusks would have been an almost physical assault, a truly nauseating odor that clung to the clothes and hair of the workers. But within this foul brew, the magic was happening. As the mixture stewed, the clear secretion began its metamorphosis, shifting through a ghostly spectrum of colors: pale yellow, then green, then a deep violet blue, and finally settling into the desired shade of vibrant, shimmering purple. The master dyer's skill was in knowing exactly when to stop the process, often by simmering the mixture in lead or tin pots to achieve the perfect hue. Different species produced different colors. The trunculus yielded a more indigo blue, while the brandaris produced the classic reddish purple. The most prized and expensive shade of all, a color described as that of clotted blood, was likely achieved by a difficult double dyeing process using both types of snail. The immense value of this dye came down to two simple factors: staggering inefficiency and miraculous permanence. The sheer number of snails required was astronomical. Modern experiments and ancient sources suggest that it took some 10 to 12,000 murex snails to produce a single gram of pure dye, barely enough to color the trim on a single Roman toga. To dye an entire robe would require hundreds of thousands of snails and a fortune in labor. This incredible scarcity alone made it an object of ultimate luxury. But its other quality was what made it seem truly divine. Unlike most ancient dyes made from plants or insects, which faded quickly in the sun and bled out in the wash, Tyrian purple was chemically stable. It was color fast. In fact, exposure to sunlight was said to make the color even deeper and more brilliant. It was a permanent mark of status, a color that would not fade. Naturally, it became the exclusive symbol of the ruling class. Kings and emperors draped themselves in it. High priests wore robes of purple. In the Roman Republic, senators wore a toga with a purple stripe, the width of the stripe denoting their rank. By the time of the Roman Empire, sumptuary laws were enacted that explicitly forbade anyone but the emperor from wearing a solid purple garment. To don the purple became a common phrase for ascending to the imperial throne. The color was power itself, made tangible. The Phoenicians themselves, masters of branding, wove a divine origin story for their signature product. The legend, recorded much later, tells of the city's patron god, Melkart, walking along the shore with his beloved nymph, Tyrus. His dog, which was running ahead, began to chew on a murex snail that had washed ashore. When the dog returned to its master, its mouth was stained a magnificent purple. The nymph Tyrus was so enchanted by the color that she told Melkart she would not be his until he could provide her with a gown of the same hue. The god therefore gathered the snails and created the first purple-dyed garment, a gift of love that founded an industry. While a charming tale, the historical reality is that the Minoans on Crete were likely the first to discover the dye. The true Phoenician genius, therefore, was not in invention, but in perfection and industrialization. They took a small-scale craft and, with their characteristic commercial zeal, scaled it up into a global monopoly, turning the humble, smelly murex snail into the engine of an international luxury brand that would define the very color of power for 1,000 years to come. The Phoenicians exported many things from their narrow coastal home. Their ships carried the tangible scent of cedar, the rough texture of silver ingots, and the shimmering, almost living color of their purple-dyed textiles. But their most valuable, most world-altering export was not an object that could be held in the hand. It was an idea, a technology for the mind, an innovation so profound that its legacy is imprinted on this very story as it unfolds. This was their alphabet, a gift of elegant simplicity that would break the elite monopoly on knowledge and change the way humanity communicates forever. To understand the sheer genius of their system, we must first recall the world of writing that existed before it. In the great empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, writing was a formidable and deliberately complex art. The hieroglyphs of the Nile Valley were a stunningly beautiful but bewildering mix of hundreds of signs. Some were logograms, intricate little pictures that represented a whole word. Others were syllabic, representing a combination of sounds, and still others were phonetic, representing a single sound. To read or write hieroglyphics required years of punishingly difficult study in a specialized scribal school. It was a closed system, designed to keep knowledge, and therefore power, in the hands of a tiny elite of priests and palace bureaucrats. The same was true of the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia, with its daunting library of hundreds of wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay. For the average person, a farmer, a soldier, a merchant, literacy was as unattainable as flight. The revolutionary idea of an alphabet, a system where one simple sign represents one basic sound, had been gestating for centuries before the Phoenicians perfected it. The first sparks of this idea seem to have been struck, fascinatingly, not in a palace or a temple, but in the harsh environment of an Egyptian turquoise mine in the Sinai Peninsula. Here, around 1800 BCE, Canaanite laborers, seeing the complex hieroglyphs of their Egyptian overlords, began a clever experiment. They adapted the Egyptian pictures to write their own Semitic language using a principle called acrophony. The logic was simple and brilliant. They took the Egyptian picture for ox, which in their language was called aleph, and used that sign to represent not the whole word, but just its first sound, the guttural stop we barely notice at the beginning of the word apple. They took the hieroglyph for water, or mayim, a simple wavy line, and used it to represent the M sound. This was the conceptual breakthrough, from picture as word to picture as sound. This Proto-Canaanite script, as it's now called, was a promising but messy and inconsistent system for several hundred years. It was the Phoenicians, with their practical mercantile mindset, who took this rough concept and refined it into a streamlined, elegant, and devastatingly efficient tool. Around 1050 BCE, they standardized a set of just 22 signs. They simplified the characters, abstracting them from their pictorial origins so they could be written quickly with a pen or stylus. The ox head became a simple, powerful shape. The wavy waterline became a sharp, rhythmic zigzag. The drawing of a house or bed became a simple enclosure. This system was a merchant's dream come true. It was purely phonetic, representing only the consonant sounds of their language. Vowels, as in many Semitic languages, were generally inferred from context. With only 22 simple signs to memorize, a person could achieve functional literacy in a matter of weeks, not a lifetime. Suddenly, a ship's captain could keep his own cargo manifest. A trader could write his own contracts on papyrus or even a pottery shard. An artisan could sign his own work. The alphabet was a tool of liberation. It democratized writing, taking it out of the exclusive hands of the scribal class and giving it to ordinary people. For a civilization built on contracts, ledgers, and long-distance communication, this was the ultimate business software, and like any killer app, it went viral. The alphabet spread not through the force of armies, but in the peaceful, profitable wake of their trading ships. Wherever Phoenician merchants established a warehouse or haggled in a marketplace, their simple, efficient writing system was on display. Other cultures saw its advantages and quickly adapted it for their own languages. The Aramaeans in the interior of Syria adopted it, creating a script that would eventually spread all the way to India. But its most fateful journey was west, across the sea to the Greeks. Sometime around the 8th century BCE, the Greeks, then emerging from a dark age in which their own earlier syllabic script had been forgotten, encountered the Phoenicians. They recognized the power of the alphabet and adopted it wholesale. The Greek historian Herodotus readily admitted this debt, calling the new writing Phoenicia Grammata, the Phoenician letters. But in adapting the script, the Greeks made one final, crucial innovation. Their language, unlike Semitic tongues, could not function without explicit vowels. In a moment of pure genius, they took the few Phoenician consonant signs for sounds that didn't exist in Greek, like the guttural aleph, and repurposed them to represent vowel sounds. Aleph became the Greek alpha, he became epsilon, yod became iota. With this masterstroke, they created the world's first true and complete alphabet, a sign for every consonant and every vowel. This Greek alphabet would later be passed to the Romans via the Etruscans, becoming the Latin alphabet used to write English today. Nearly every alphabet in the world, from Arabic and Hebrew to Cyrillic and English, is a descendant of that elegant set of 22 signs standardized in the ports of Tyre and Sidon. It was their quietest revolution, an invisible cargo of pure information that empowered the world. Armed with their revolutionary ships and their ruthlessly efficient alphabet, the sailors of Tyre were ready to push the boundaries of their world. Their motivation was not the conquest of land or the glory of battle. It was a far more practical and urgent quest for the raw materials that fueled the ancient economy. Metals. The great collapse of the Bronze Age had shattered the old trade networks, creating a kind of metal famine across the Mediterranean. Tin, essential for making bronze, was scarce. Copper was in constant demand, and the emerging Iron Age created a voracious appetite for this new, stronger metal. Above all, there was a desperate need for silver, the closest thing the ancient world had to a universal currency. For the sharp-minded merchants of Tyre, this scarcity was the business opportunity of a lifetime, and whispers and sailors' tales pointed to a semi-mythical land in the far west, a place of legendary mineral wealth. They called it Tarshish. To the people of the Levant, Tarshish was a name that conjured visions of unimaginable riches. The Hebrew Bible speaks of it as the source of King Solomon's wealth, a distant port whose magnificent ships of Tarshish would return laden with gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. The prophet Ezekiel, in a lament for Tyre's eventual downfall, lists its riches. Tarshish was your merchant because of your great wealth of every kind. Silver, iron, tin, and lead they exchanged for your wares. It was an El Dorado of the Iron Age, a treasure chest at the very edge of the known world. But where was it? This remains a tantalizing historical mystery. While some have proposed locations as varied as Sardinia or even India, the overwhelming consensus among historians and archaeologists today points to one region, the southern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. Specifically, the area around the Tartessian civilization, near the Guadalquivir River, a region known even today for its vast deposits of silver and other metals. The voyage from Tyre to Tarshish was one of the great maritime undertakings of the ancient world, a journey of some 2,000 miles into the unknown. It was the Iron Age equivalent of a transatlantic crossing, a perilous expedition that would take many months and test the limits of their ships and their courage. A Tyrian captain setting out on this quest would first sail north, using the prevailing currents to move up the Levantine coast before turning west past Cyprus. From there, it was a long and arduous process of cabotage, hopping along the southern coast of Anatolia, navigating between the scattered islands of the Aegean, and then making the dangerous open water crossings past Crete and towards Sicily. Every leg of the journey was fraught with danger. The sea was infested with pirates, opportunistic raiders who would see a heavy-laden merchant ship as a floating treasure chest. And then there were the storms, which could appear with terrifying speed, turning the sea into a churning chaos that could splinter even the strongest cedar hull. These sailors personified the storm as a great sea monster, a leviathan from the depths, and their journeys were as much a spiritual struggle as a physical one, requiring constant prayers and offerings to Baal and Astarte to keep the monster at bay. As they pushed further west, past Sardinia and the Balearic Islands, they entered a world their ancestors had never known. Finally, they would have reached the ultimate gateway, a narrow strait of water flanked by two towering mountains of rock. This was the threshold the Greeks would later call the Pillars of Hercules, what we know as the Strait of Gibraltar. To sail through it was to leave the familiar enclosed world of the Mediterranean and enter the vast, terrifying, and unknown Atlantic Ocean. It was, in their minds, to sail off the edge of the map, but the prize that awaited them was worth every risk. The land they found in Iberia was not empty. It was home to a sophisticated local culture. The Phoenicians did not come as conquerors. They came as they always did, as traders. They established a small outpost on an island just off the Atlantic coast, a perfect, defensible harbor they called Gadir, the walled place. We know it today as Carthage, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. Here, they set up a marketplace. From the holds of their ships, they offered the wonders of the East: fine linen, intricately carved ivory trinkets from Syria, beautiful glass beads, and of course, the status-defining luxury of their purple-dyed textiles. In exchange for these manufactured goods, the local Iberian chieftains offered the raw materials the Phoenicians craved. Great quantities of silver, dug from the rich mines of the Rio Tinto region, were brought to Gadir. There, on the shore, the silver ingots would be weighed in balances, while a Phoenician scribe, using his simple 22-letter alphabet, would note the transaction on a shard of pottery or a scrap of papyrus. This trade route became the main artery of Tyre's wealth, pumping a river of silver from the far west into the city's coffers. This silver funded the construction of Hiram's great temples, paid for the expansion of their fleets, and financed further colonial ventures. The quest for Tarshish was the ultimate expression of the Phoenician character: pragmatic, audacious, and relentlessly commercial. They saw a need in the market, and they sailed to the end of the earth to fill it, braving monsters both real and imagined, not for glory, but for profit. In doing so, they stitched the far ends of the Mediterranean together into a single economic web, forever changing the world for everyone. The successful establishment of a trading post as far away as Gadir was not an end, but a beginning. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the world was larger and richer than anyone in the Levant had previously imagined. But a single, distant outpost, 2,000 miles from home, is a fragile thing. To make the silver route to Tarshish sustainable and profitable, and to capitalize on other opportunities along the way, the Phoenicians needed more than just a destination. They needed a network. They needed a series of safe harbors, supply depots, and markets that would function like a chain of interstellar refueling stations for their slow-moving merchant ships. And so began the next phase of their expansion: the methodical, strategic, and commercially brilliant creation of a network of colonies that would stretch from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. It's crucial to understand that a Phoenician colony was a very different enterprise from the colonies of the later Greek or Roman empires. The Greeks, facing population pressure and a shortage of farmland at home, sent out their people to seize territory and create new independent city-states, new agricultural homelands. The Romans would later march their legions across the world to conquer, subjugate, and administer vast swathes of land. The Phoenicians, for the most part, did neither. Their colonization was driven by the logic of a multinational corporation opening branch offices, not by an emperor seeking to conquer new lands. Each settlement was a strategic node in a vast commercial web, a point of presence designed to secure a trade route, exploit a local resource, or open a new market. The primary motivation was logistical. The long and hazardous voyage to Spain was too much to undertake in a single, non-stop journey. Their tubby merchant ships, the Gaulois, were slow and vulnerable. They needed a string of pearls, a series of friendly ports where they could reliably find shelter from a sudden storm, repair a broken mast, rest their weary crews, and most importantly, restock their vital supplies of fresh water and food. Each colony was a stepping stone, reducing the length of the dangerous open water passages and making the entire enterprise safer and more predictable. Each new settlement was another knot in the safety net they were weaving across the sea. These logistical hubs were, of course, placed in locations that offered their own commercial advantages. The Phoenicians had an uncanny eye for prime real estate, and their choice of location for a new settlement was remarkably consistent. They almost never built their colonies far inland. Instead, they would look for a specific set of geographical features: a small island just off the coast, a narrow peninsula with a defensible isthmus, or a high rocky headland with a deep, sheltered harbor. This model, a direct echo of their own capital at Tyre, offered them maximum security with a minimal need for a standing army. They could defend themselves from potentially hostile local populations while controlling the sea lanes, ensuring their connection to the homeland and the wider network remained open. A typical Phoenician colony in its early days was not a sprawling city. It was an emporium, a dedicated trading post. A new settlement would begin with the construction of a small temple, almost always dedicated to Melkart, the patron god of Tyre and the divine protector of explorers. This was a way of planting the Tyrian flag and sanctifying the enterprise. Alongside the temple, they would build large, secure warehouses to store their own trade goods and the raw materials they acquired from the locals. A small workshop for ship repairs and a marketplace would complete the initial settlement. Their relationship with the native peoples of these lands was generally peaceful and symbiotic. They were not there to displace them, but to do business with them, offering the local elites the exotic luxuries of the East in exchange for access to their resources. Mapping their network is like tracing the arteries of ancient commerce. Moving west from the Levant, their first and most important colony was at Kition, on the southern coast of Cyprus, which gave them direct control over the island's immensely rich copper mines. From there, they made the leap to the central Mediterranean, establishing key settlements in Sicily, like Mortia, a perfect example of a colony built on a tiny, defensible island in a shallow lagoon. On the large, mineral-rich island of Sardinia, they founded cities like Nora and Tharos, which became hubs for the trade in lead and silver. But their most extensive and consequential chain of colonies was built along the coast of North Africa. Cities like Utica, according to tradition, one of their very oldest settlements, and later, the city that would one day eclipse Tyre itself, Carthage, were founded along this shore. This North African route provided an alternative southern passage to the west, a vital corridor leading towards the ultimate prize, Spain and the silver of Tarshish, anchored by their great western outpost at Gadir. A fascinating historical puzzle arises when we compare the ancient traditions to modern archaeology. Roman historians, relying on older accounts, give incredibly early founding dates for some of these colonies: Utica in 1101 BCE, Gadir in 1100 BCE. Yet for decades, archaeologists digging at these sites could find no definitive proof of a Phoenician presence before the 9th or 8th centuries BCE, a gap of some 300 years. Why the discrepancy? The most elegant hypothesis suggests that both accounts are true, but they are describing different things. The legendary founding date may commemorate the very first official trading expedition to a site, the day the first Phoenician ship dropped anchor and began to trade. This might have been followed by decades or even centuries of seasonal contact, with sailors setting up temporary summer camps to trade before returning home for the winter. The later archaeological dates, then, would mark the point when Tyre made the major investment to build a permanent, year-round settlement with stone temples and warehouses. The legend remembers the first handshake, while the archaeology uncovers the first permanent office. This vast network of colonies was Tyre's greatest masterpiece, a testament to a vision that saw the entire Mediterranean not as a sea of boundaries, but as a single integrated marketplace waiting to be born. Among all the pearls in the great commercial network of the Phoenicians, one was destined to grow with such astonishing size and luster that it would one day eclipse its own mother of pearl, the city of Tyre itself. Its official name was Hadasht, a simple and direct name in the Phoenician tongue, the new city. We know it better by its later Romanized name, Carthage. Its location on the coast of modern Tunisia was a stroke of strategic genius, a perfect harbor on a defensible peninsula that controlled the narrowest passage in the central Mediterranean. But the story of its founding, unlike that of a simple trading post, was not a coolly calculated business decision. It was a story born of fire and blood, of palace intrigue, sacrilegious murder, and the defiant flight of a fugitive queen. The legend begins in Tyre, near the end of the 9th century BCE. The city was at the height of its power, but the royal court was poisoned by ambition. The reigning king had 2 children, a son, Pygmalion, and a daughter, Elissa. Elissa was a formidable woman, brilliant and influential, and she was married to the second most powerful man in the kingdom, Akabas, who was the high priest of Melkart. As high priest, Akabas not only commanded immense spiritual authority, but also controlled the vast, unimaginable wealth of the temple, a treasury swollen with the offerings of generations of pious and successful merchants. When the old king died, his will decreed that his son Pygmalion and his daughter Elissa should rule jointly. But Pygmalion, consumed by a venomous greed, had no intention of sharing power, and his covetous eyes were fixed on the temple's gold. Ignoring the bonds of family and the sanctity of the gods, Pygmalion committed a terrible crime. He arranged for his brother-in-law, Akabas, to be ambushed and murdered, an act of supreme sacrilege. Pygmalion then seized the temple and its riches, hiding the body of his victim and pretending that Aherbas had simply vanished. He tried to force his sister Elissa to accept his sole rule, but she was not so easily deceived. The legend tells that one night, the ghost of her murdered husband appeared to her in a dream. His phantom form, pale and wounded, revealed the truth of Pygmalion's treachery, and crucially, told her the location where the true ancient treasure of the temple was hidden, safe from the new king's grasp. Elissa, now known to history by her nickname Dido, meaning the wanderer, knew her own life was in danger. She could not remain in a city ruled by her brother, the murderer of her husband. Quietly, she began to plot. She gathered a secret following from among the Tyrian aristocracy, senators and nobles who were disgusted by Pygmalion's tyranny and feared for their own futures. With their loyalty secured, Dido devised a brilliant ruse. She went to her brother and told him that she wished to put her grief behind her and move into the royal palace with him. To do this, she said, she would need him to provide ships so she could transport the possessions of her late husband. Pygmalion, believing his sister had finally submitted and that he would soon have his hands on Acherbas's personal fortune, readily agreed. The ships were brought to the harbor, but under the cloak of night, Dido's loyal followers did not load them with furniture and household goods. Instead, they loaded them with the secret, true treasure of the temple, the gold that Acherbas had told her of in the dream. As a final act of misdirection, they filled several large sacks with worthless sand and, in full view of Pygmalion's guards, dramatically heaved them into the water, crying out that this was the cursed gold of Acherbas, and they were offering it to the sea. The guards, believing the treasure was now lost forever, did nothing as Dido and her followers boarded the ships and slipped out of the harbor, a band of political exiles sailing west into the unknown. After a brief stop on Cyprus, where they were joined by more followers, Dido's small fleet landed on the coast of North Africa. She began to negotiate with the local Berber lord, Iarbas, for a grant of land to build a new home for her people. Iarbas, seeing a woman leading a small band of refugees, decided to mock her. He agreed to sell her only as much land as could be contained within the hide of a single ox. It was an insulting offer, meant to give her a tiny, useless patch of ground. But Dido, whose cleverness was her greatest weapon, accepted the deal. She then took the ox hide and had her followers cut it into the thinnest, finest strips imaginable. When these thousands of hair-thin strips were tied together end to end, they formed a single cord of astonishing length. Dido used this cord to lay out the boundaries of her new territory, encircling a large and strategically perfect hill that commanded the harbor. She had used the king's own words to outwit him. That hill became the citadel of her new city, the Bursa, which means the hide. And so Carthage, the new city, was born. How much of this dramatic story is true? Pygmalion was a real historical king of Tyre. The city was certainly rife with political factions and a violent schism, leading a group of disaffected nobles to leave and found a new settlement is entirely plausible. Dido herself may be a legendary figure, a romantic personification of the city's spirit, yet she may also be based on a real, unnamed Tyrian princess who led the expedition. Whether literally true or not, the legend of Dido gave Carthage a powerful and enduring founding myth. It established their identity not as a mere colonial offshoot of Tyre, but as a city founded in an act of defiance, built on ingenuity, rather than brute force, and born from the courage of a queen who refused to bow to a tyrant. This spirit of fierce independence would define Carthage for centuries to come and set it on a collision course with the other great rising power of the Mediterranean, Rome. The founding of a great new city like Carthage was not just the end of a dramatic escape. It was the creation of a major new hub in an already sprawling network of commerce, a new jewel in a crown that already sparkled with ports and outposts across the sea. To understand the power of the Phoenicians, to grasp the engine that drove their civilization, we must look inside the holds of their ships, peek into their bustling workshops, and browse the overflowing stalls of their marketplaces. They were the indispensable middlemen of their age, the master artisans, the premier importers and exporters. Their homeland was not a great agricultural plain or a mighty fortress, but a dynamic, world-straddling marketplace. Their entire enterprise was built on a simple, brilliant formula: acquire cheap raw materials from the peripheries of their world, transform them into high-value luxury goods in the workshops of their home cities, and then sell these finished products back to the world at a tremendous profit. It was a cycle of sourcing, manufacturing, and distribution on a scale the world had never seen before. The import process alone was a marvel of logistical coordination. Their ships systematically combed the known world for its natural treasures. From the far west, from their prized land of Tarshish in Spain, came the lifeblood of their economy, a torrent of silver, the currency of kings, along with vast quantities of tin, the irreplaceable ingredient for making bronze and industrial metals like lead and iron. From the north, they procured more iron and copper from Anatolia and the Caucasus, and they traded for the sophisticated and beautiful painted pottery of the emerging Greek city-states. From the south came the ancient, reliable wealth of Egypt. The fertile Nile Delta provided a steady supply of grain, a vital food import to supplement the meager harvests of their own narrow coastal plain. From Egypt, they also acquired papyrus, the plant-based paper that was essential for their record-keeping, and the world's finest linen textiles. Caravans whose routes terminated in their cities brought the treasures of Africa up to the coast. Gold dust, precious ivory tusks, and exotic curiosities like ostrich eggs, whose large, smooth surfaces made them perfect canvases for intricate painting and carving. And from the east, via the long and dusty overland caravan trails that snaked across the deserts of Arabia and Syria, came the scents of the gods. Immense quantities of frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins that were burned in every temple from Babylon to Thebes, and were worth more than their weight in silver. But the true genius of the Phoenicians lay in what happened next. They were not merely shippers, they were manufacturers. The raw materials that flowed into the ports of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were funneled into bustling, noisy, and phenomenally productive workshops. Here, their legendary skills as artisans came to the fore. Raw wool from the hills of Syria and fine linen from Egypt would enter their dye works and emerge as the most coveted textiles on earth, shimmering with the impossibly deep and permanent hue of Tyrian purple. Their metal workers, renowned for their skill, would take the rough ingots of silver and gold and transform them into exquisite jewelry, delicate filigree earrings, heavy armbands, and ornate pendants. They crafted magnificent ceremonial bowls and platters of bronze and silver, often decorated with a unique fusion of Egyptian and Assyrian artistic styles. The city of Sidon, in particular, became the ancient world's center for glassmaking. Using the fine sand of their local beaches, their artisans perfected the sand core technique. They would form a core of sand and clay in the shape of a small vessel, dip it repeatedly into molten glass, and then, once it had cooled, break and pour out the core, leaving a small, beautiful, and brightly colored glass bottle. These little flasks, designed to hold precious perfumes and cosmetics, were a smash hit among the wealthy elites across the Mediterranean. In other workshops, the raw tusks of African ivory were transformed by their carvers into masterpieces of miniature art. Decorative plaques for inlaying in royal furniture, combs, cosmetic boxes, and religious icons, all rendered with astonishing detail. They were, in essence, the luxury brand manufacturers of their day, turning the world's raw potential into objects of focused, refined desire. Once transformed, this glittering portfolio of goods was loaded back onto their ships and exported to the world, often sold back to the very regions from which the raw materials had come. The Iberian chieftain who sold them silver would buy it back in the form of an ornate necklace for his wife. The Egyptian noble who sold them linen would buy it back as a magnificent purple-trimmed robe. But they also acted as pure distributors, the circulatory system of the entire Mediterranean. They would buy grain in Egypt and sell it to the inhabitants of Sardinia. They would buy Greek pottery and trade it in the Levant for goods they could then sell in Cyprus. They connected everyone, creating a dynamic, interdependent economy where once there had been only isolated pockets of production. How they managed to trade with so many different cultures, some of whom were surely distrustful of foreign sailors, is a fascinating question. The Greek historian Herodotus describes a remarkable process used by the Carthaginians on the coast of Africa, a method known as silent trade. When the Phoenician ships arrived, the sailors would unload their goods and arrange them neatly on a beach. They would then retreat to their ships and send up a signal of smoke. The local tribesmen, seeing the smoke, would come down to the beach, inspect the items, and place a quantity of gold on the ground next to the goods they wished to purchase. They would then retreat. The Phoenicians would row back to shore to examine the offer. If they felt the amount of gold was fair, they would take it and leave the goods, and the deal was done. If not, they would return to their ships without touching the gold, signaling that they required a higher price. The tribesmen would then return and add more gold. This process, conducted without a single word spoken, based on a foundation of mutual trust and respect, allowed them to bridge the chasm of language and culture. It was a system that was practical, peaceful, and quintessentially Phoenician. All of this relentless activity, this ceaseless movement of goods and people across the wine-dark sea, was not conducted in a spiritual vacuum. The Phoenicians were a deeply pious people, their lives interwoven with a complex and powerful spiritual worldview. Their every voyage, every business contract, every harvest was lived under the watchful and often capricious eyes of their gods. To understand them, we must look beyond their marketplaces and into their temples, for it was their faith that provided the ultimate framework for their existence, offering both profound comfort and perhaps a terrifying and absolute demand. Their religion was a direct inheritance from their Canaanite ancestors, a faith that had been shaped for centuries by the rhythms of life in the Levant. At the head of their pantheon, reigning in serene and distant majesty, was the creator god, El. He was imagined as the wise, grey-bearded patriarch, the ultimate authority who presided over the divine council on a cosmic mountain. But like a venerable chairman of the board, El was more respected than actively worshipped in the day-to-day cult. The real dynamic power in the heavens belonged to the younger, more vigorous gods, who directly governed the forces of nature. The chief among these was Baal Hammon, the lord of the incense altar. Baal was the great god of the sky and the storm, a figure of immense power and vitality. He was the one who rode upon the clouds, whose voice was the rolling thunder, and whose weapon was the jagged lightning bolt. For the Phoenicians, whose limited agriculture depended entirely on the winter rains, Baal's favor was a matter of life and death. He was the god of fertility, order, and cosmic kingship, often depicted as a mighty, bearded king seated on a throne. As the Phoenicians spread west, the cult of Baal Hammon traveled with them, and he would become the supreme deity of their greatest colony, Carthage. Balancing Baal's masculine power was the great goddess of the pantheon, Astarte, known as Ashtart in their own tongue. She was the queen of heaven, a complex and multifaceted deity who was arguably the most popular and beloved of all their gods. Astarte was a goddess of fertility, love, and sexuality, the divine force of life and creation. Yet she was no gentle mother goddess. She was also a fierce and powerful goddess of war, often depicted standing on a lion, a symbol of her untamable power. For a seafaring people, her most important role was celestial. She was the personification of the planet Venus, the brilliant morning and evening star. As the brightest and most predictable light in the night sky after the moon, she was a vital navigational aid, the divine guide who led their ships safely through the darkness. Astarte was their protector, their provider, and their guiding light on the horizon, while El, Baal, and Astarte were worshipped across the Phoenician world. Their faith also had a strong local character. Each great city had its own patron deity, a divine protector with a special relationship to its people. The most important of these was Melkart, the king of the city, the patron god of Tyre. As Tyre grew to become the dominant Phoenician metropolis, so too did the importance of its god. Melkart was a perfect deity for an ambitious seafaring people. He was a god of the sea and of navigation, but also a hero god who represented the civilizing forces of colonization and trade. Like the seasons themselves, Melkart's story was a cycle of death and rebirth. It was believed that he died and was resurrected each year, an event celebrated with a great festival in the spring that marked the end of the stormy winter and the reopening of the sailing season. The Greeks, recognizing this heroic, civilizing character, quickly identified Melkart as their own Heracles, and his great temple in Tyre was one of the most revered sanctuaries in the ancient world. But this vibrant faith had a darker, more terrifying dimension, one that has stained the memory of the Phoenicians for millennia and remains one of history's most contentious and disturbing mysteries. Their enemies, primarily the Greeks, Romans, and the writers of the Hebrew Bible, accused them of the horrific practice of child sacrifice. These accounts, written with a mixture of horror and propaganda, describe how in times of great crisis, a famine, a plague, a devastating siege, the Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians, would sacrifice their own children to appease the gods. They tell of a massive bronze statue of Baal Hammon, or a god they call Moloch, with a monstrous head and outstretched arms. The infant, often the firstborn son of a noble family, would be placed in the statue's arms, which would then tilt, rolling the living child into a pit of roaring fire below. For centuries, many historians dismissed these stories as baseless slander, vicious propaganda designed by rivals to dehumanize their commercial competitors. But then came the archaeology. Beginning in the 20th century, archaeologists discovered sacred enclosures just outside Carthage and other Phoenician settlements in Sardinia, Sicily, and Malta. They called these places Topets, borrowing a name from the Old Testament for a site of child sacrifice. Within these enclosures, they unearthed thousands of small clay urns, buried under carved stone markers called stelae. Inside the urns were the cremated remains of human infants, most of them newborns, along with the bones of young animals. Many of the stelae are inscribed with dedications, thanking the gods Baal Hammon and his consort Tanit for hearing my voice. What are these Topets? Do they confirm the lurid tales of their enemies? This is the heart of the mystery, and historians remain deeply divided. One interpretation is that the literary and archaeological evidence align perfectly. These are the remains of sacrificed children, and the inscriptions are thank you notes for the god accepting the terrible offering. But a powerful counterargument suggests another possibility. This view holds that the Tophet was a special consecrated cemetery for children who were stillborn or died of natural causes in early infancy. In a world with appallingly high infant mortality, such cemeteries would have been large. Because these infants died in a state of purity, they were given a sacred burial, and the inscriptions are not thanks for a sacrifice, but pleas for the gods to watch over the soul of the lost child. In this interpretation, the stories of sacrifice were indeed black propaganda. The truth remains buried with those tiny bones, a chilling ambiguity at the heart of the Phoenician soul. Their gods, who gave them so much, may in the end have demanded the one thing a parent could never bear to give. While the priests of Tyre and Sidon made their offerings to Baal and Melkart, and their merchants calculated profits from the silver of Spain, a new and terrifying power was rising from the east, from the dusty plains of northern Mesopotamia, along the banks of the river Tigris. The Neo-Assyrian Empire began an expansion that would consume everything in its path. This was not just another kingdom. It was a sophisticated and merciless military machine, organized for total war and bent on absolute domination. For the free, wealthy, and independent sea-trading cities of Phoenicia, the westward march of the Assyrian armies marked the beginning of a long and dangerous new era, an age of living in the shadow of a superpower. The Assyrian state was the juggernaut of the early Iron Age. Their kings, with fearsome names like Ashurnasirpal, Tiglath-Pileser, and Sennacherib, commanded disciplined professional armies equipped with the latest iron weaponry. They were the undisputed masters of siege warfare, employing massive armored battering rams, mobile siege towers, and corps of engineers who could undermine the strongest city walls. But their most effective weapon was terror. Assyrian kings celebrated their victories not with monuments to peace, but with gruesome reliefs and inscriptions detailing the brutal fates of those who defied them. They flayed rebellious rulers, and draped their skin upon their city walls. They created mountains of skulls from their defeated enemies, and they practiced mass deportation, uprooting entire populations and scattering them across their empire to break their spirits and destroy their identities. Inevitably, this relentless westward expansion brought the Assyrian war machine to the shores of the Mediterranean. For the Assyrian kings, reaching the Great Sea was a moment of supreme symbolic triumph. King Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BCE reached the coast, and as his official records boast, he cleansed his weapons in the deep sea and made sacrifices to the gods. The sight of the Assyrian army appearing on the hills overlooking their cities must have struck a cold dread into the hearts of the Phoenician kings. They had to confront a fundamental clash of worlds. The greatest land power on earth had come face to face with the greatest sea power. This created a strategic stalemate. The Assyrians could dominate the land with ease, conquering the agricultural territories behind the Phoenician cities and burning their mainland suburbs. But the Assyrians were a landlocked people. They had no navy and no experience of maritime warfare. The island fortress of Tyre, sitting securely a half-mile out to sea, and the island city of Arwad to the north, presented a problem their battering rams could not solve. They could blockade the cities from the land, but they could not mount a direct assault. The Phoenician cities, in turn, knew that they could survive on their islands for a time, but they could not defeat the Assyrian army on land. A prolonged war would mean the destruction of their trade routes, the loss of their vital timber resources from the mountains, and eventual starvation. Faced with this grim calculus, the Phoenicians chose the path of pragmatism over pointless defiance. They chose to trade their complete independence for their continued survival and prosperity. One by one, the kings of Byblos, Sidon, and even the proud king of Tyre sailed to the Assyrian camp or sent envoys, bowed before the Assyrian monarch, and formally became his vassals. This was, in essence, a protection racket on an imperial scale. The deal was simple. The Phoenician cities would pay a massive annual tribute to the Assyrian king. In return, the Assyrians would allow them to keep their own kings, their own religion, their own language, and most importantly, their vast international trading network. The Assyrian kings were not fools. They understood that the Phoenician trade network was a golden goose. It was far more profitable to tax it than to destroy it. The Assyrian royal annals provide a detailed accounting of this tribute, listing the immense wealth that flowed from the coast into their coffers. From the king of Tyre, they received staggering quantities of gold, silver, linen garments with multicolored trimmings, and fine cloth of dark purple wool. They demanded ebony, ivory, and of course, the great cedar and juniper logs that were so prized by the Mesopotamian kings for their own palace and temple construction. For the Phoenicians, this tribute, as heavy as it was, became simply another cost of doing business. They were forced to channel their legendary commercial energies into making even greater profits, just to be able to afford the annual payment that kept the Assyrian army at bay. This tense arrangement, however, would sometimes break. Spurred on by promises of aid from Assyria's great rival, Egypt, or sensing a moment of weakness during a succession crisis in the Assyrian court, a Phoenician king might get bold and withhold his tribute. The Assyrian response to such rebellion was always swift and catastrophically violent. In the early 7th century BCE, the king of Sidon, Abdi-Milkati, rebelled against the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. The Assyrian army descended upon the city, and after a siege, razed it to the ground. Esarhaddon, in his own words, tore out its ramparts and its walls and cast them into the sea. He had King Abdi Milkuti beheaded, and on his victory monument, he had himself depicted as a giant holding the defeated kings of Egypt and Sidon on leashes like dogs. It was a chillingly effective piece of propaganda, a message sent to all the other vassal states, and especially to Tyre, about the price of disobedience. Yet, a fascinating historical question remains. Did living under the Assyrian shadow ultimately harm or help the Phoenician economy? While the tribute was a massive financial drain, the arrangement may have had paradoxical benefits. The Assyrian Empire created a vast unified economic zone under a single authority. For the first time, a Phoenician merchant could, in theory, travel on trade routes deep into Mesopotamia with the security of the Assyrian peace. The Assyrian elites, enriched by the plunder of their empire, became a huge new market for Phoenician luxury goods. As long as they paid their dues, the Phoenicians became the official maritime merchants, the luxury goods suppliers, and the shipping agents for their own overlords. They had survived their first great existential threat, not by fighting, but by turning their subjugation into the biggest business contract in the world. The brutal Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for 3 centuries, was a fearsome and predictable beast. But like all great predators, it eventually grew old and was brought down by younger, hungrier rivals. The fall of its capital, Nineveh, in 612 BCE, to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sent shockwaves across the region. For the long-suffering cities of Phoenicia, however, this was not a moment of liberation. It was merely a change of management. Out of the ashes of Assyria rose the glittering and ambitious Neo-Babylonian Empire, and its greatest king, Nebuchadnezzar II, had his eyes fixed firmly on the riches of the Levant. The defiant city of Tyre, which had managed the Assyrians for so long, was about to face the greatest test of its existence. Nebuchadnezzar II was a figure of immense power and historical resonance. He was not just a conqueror, but a builder on a scale that beggared belief. The man who would transform his capital, Babylon, into the largest and most magnificent city in the world, complete with the legendary Ishtar Gate and the fabled Hanging Gardens. Like the Assyrian kings before him, he knew that to secure his empire, he had to control the western trade routes that terminated on the Phoenician coast. The wealth that flowed through Tyre was essential for funding his grand projects. Furthermore, his great rival, Egypt, was once again stirring up trouble in the region, encouraging the small Levantine states to rebel against Babylonian authority. The king of Tyre at the time, Ithobal III, made a fateful decision. He chose to defy the new Babylonian superpower, placing his faith in an alliance with the Egyptian pharaoh Apries. He withheld tribute and effectively declared his city's independence. For Nebuchadnezzar, this was an act of rebellion that could not be tolerated. In 586 BCE, having already conquered the kingdom of Judah and destroyed Jerusalem, he marched his victorious and seemingly invincible army to the coast of Lebanon. His goal was to make a final, brutal example of the last holdout, the proud and stubborn island city of Tyre. The stage was set for one of the most epic and grueling sieges in the history of the ancient world. When the vast Babylonian army arrived and set up camp on the mainland, they were confronted with the same strategic nightmare that had frustrated the Assyrians. Before them, half a mile out to sea, the island of Tyre glittered defiantly, its stone walls rising directly from the waves. The city's two harbors were full of ships, able to bring in supplies from its colonies and allies across the sea. Nebuchadnezzar's mighty legions, his siege engines, and his cavalry were all useless. He was a master of the land, but Tyre was a creature of the sea. Frustrated but implacable, Nebuchadnezzar refused to be deterred. If he could not sail to the island, he would bring the land to the island. He commanded his engineers to undertake a monumental, almost insane feat of construction. They were to build a causeway, a solid land bridge or mole, right across the sea channel to the city walls. And so, the great siege began. The sound of thousands of axes echoed in the mountains as Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers and conscripted laborers felled the ancient cedar and cypress forests of Lebanon. An army of quarrymen chipped away at the rock, and a never-ending train of workers hauled millions of tons of stone, earth, and timber to the shore. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to dump the fill into the sea, creating a man-made peninsula that inched its way foot by agonizing foot out towards the island. The Tyrians, however, did not wait passively for their doom. From the safety of their walls, their archers rained down arrows upon the work crews. Their small, agile warships, the Byrames, swarmed around the edges of the construction site, harassing the Babylonian barges and disrupting the flow of materials. They launched daring commando raids under the cover of darkness. Most effectively, they employed fire ships, old vessels packed with sulfur, pitch, and other combustibles. They would wait for a favorable wind, set these ships ablaze, and guide them directly into the wooden support structures and siege towers at the head of the mole, turning years of Babylonian labor into a raging inferno. The siege became a colossal battle of wills. It dragged on, month after month, year after year. A whole decade passed. A soldier in Nebuchadnezzar's army, who had arrived as a young man, was now middle-aged. A child, born within the walls of Tyre at the start of the siege, was now a teenager who had never set foot on the mainland, for whom the state of siege was the only reality they had ever known. It was a 13-year testament to Tyrian resolve and Babylonian persistence. A slow, grinding war of attrition that became legendary throughout the ancient world. But how did it end? This is one of the great historical mysteries of the age, for the sources fall strangely silent. There is no triumphant Babylonian inscription boasting of the sack of Tyre. The Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, who had confidently predicted the city's utter annihilation by Nebuchadnezzar, later issued a second remarkable prophecy. He admitted that Nebuchadnezzar and his army had labored hard against Tyre, but in the end, they got no wages from Tyre for the labor that he had performed against it. The evidence strongly suggests that the siege did not end with a bloody assault and a Babylonian victory. The most likely scenario is a negotiated settlement. After 13 exhausting years, with the causeway perhaps still unfinished and his army on the verge of mutiny, Nebuchadnezzar likely accepted a compromise. Tyre agreed to submit, to formally acknowledge Babylonian authority and pay tribute once more. In return, Nebuchadnezzar could claim a symbolic victory, save face, and march his weary army away. Tyre had survived. The island had not been breached. It was an astonishing feat of endurance. But it was a victory that came at a catastrophic cost. 13 years of blockade had strangled its trade and shattered its economy. The city was exhausted, its treasury empty, its spirit worn thin. It had stared down the most powerful king on earth and held its ground, but the effort had bled the city of its strength, and its golden age of true independence was now well and truly over. The Babylonian Empire, for all its golden splendor under Nebuchadnezzar, was surprisingly short-lived. Its foundations were brittle, and in 539 BCE, it was conquered by a new and dynamic power rising from the highlands of Iran, the Persians, led by their visionary king, Cyrus the Great. As the Persian army marched triumphantly through the gates of Babylon, the Phoenician cities, now well practiced in the art of political survival, once again found themselves with a new master. But this time, the relationship would be profoundly different. The Persians were not the Babylonians, and they were certainly not the Assyrians. For the Phoenicians, this change of management would usher in an era not of reluctant vassalage, but of privileged partnership. Cyrus and his successors in the Achaemenid dynasty governed their vast multicultural empire with a remarkably different philosophy. Where the Assyrians had ruled through terror and deportation, the Persians practiced a policy of relative tolerance and local autonomy. Cyrus famously allowed the Jews, exiled in Babylon, to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. He presented himself not as a brutal conqueror, but as a liberator who respected the customs and religions of his subjects. For the pragmatic Phoenicians, this was a welcome and reassuring change. They quickly and peacefully submitted to Persian authority, and in return, they were granted a status unlike any they had known before. The Persian kings, from Cyrus to Darius the Great, and his son Xerxes, presided over the largest empire the world had ever seen, a colossal territory that stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea. But this mighty land empire had a critical, glaring weakness. It had no navy. The Persians were a people of the highlands and plains, horsemen and archers, not sailors. Yet, their imperial ambitions lay to the west, across the water. They needed to control the eastern Mediterranean, conquer Egypt, and fatefully, they dreamed of subjugating the troublesome and fiercely independent city-states of Greece. To project their power across the sea, to transport their vast armies, and to keep them supplied, they needed a world-class fleet. And there was only one place in their entire sprawling empire where such a fleet could be built, crewed, and commanded by the most experienced sailors on earth: the shipyards of Phoenicia. This mutual need formed the basis of a grand strategic bargain. The Phoenician cities would become the indispensable maritime arm of the Persian Empire. Their shipwrights would build the mighty triremes, their forests would provide the timber, and their captains and crews would command the most prestigious squadron in the great king's navy. In exchange for this vital service, they were treated not as conquered subjects, but as esteemed and essential allies. While they still paid an annual tribute, the kings of Tyre and Sidon were given honored places in the imperial council. Herodotus tells us they had seats of honor, second only to the Persian king himself in council meetings. For the first time in centuries, they had a voice at the imperial table. Their expertise in naval and commercial matters highly valued by their overlords. This partnership was cemented during the Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE. The Persian army, under King Cambyses II, had to march across the punishingly arid Sinai Desert, a logistical nightmare. It was the Phoenician fleet that made the invasion possible, shadowing the army's advance along the coastline, carrying its supplies of food and fresh water, and landing troops where needed. Without this naval support, the land army would have withered in the desert. The success of the Egyptian campaign proved the Phoenicians' immense value and solidified their privileged position within the empire. Their service reached its famous and fateful climax during the great Persian invasions of Greece. When King Xerxes assembled his colossal invasion force in 480 BCE to crush Athens and Sparta, the naval contingent was the largest the world had ever seen. And at its heart, as always, were the squadrons from Tyre and Sidon. At the cataclysmic Battle of Salamis, where the Greek and Persian fleets met in the narrow straits near Athens, the Greek historian Herodotus, no friend to the Persians, makes a point of singling out the Phoenicians. He notes that they fought with the greatest skill and courage of all the forces in the great king's navy. But in the tight, chaotic confines of the strait, their superior numbers were neutralized by the heavier, more maneuverable Greek triremes. The Persian fleet was routed, and the invasion of Greece was doomed. What happened next, however, was a moment of profound and foolish betrayal. Xerxes, watching the disaster unfold from a golden throne set up on the shoreline, flew into a rage. Looking for a scapegoat for the humiliating defeat, he listened to the panicked accusations of rival commanders and ordered several of the leading Phoenician captains to be beheaded on the spot for supposed cowardice and incompetence. This act was a catastrophic misjudgment. The king had publicly executed the commanders of his most loyal and effective naval contingent, the very men whose bravery even his enemies acknowledged. For the Phoenicians, this was an unforgivable insult, a sign that for all their loyal service, in the end, they were seen as nothing more than disposable foreign subjects. This moment of betrayal at Salamis likely marked the beginning of the end for the warm relationship between Persia and its Phoenician mariners. A deep sense of resentment seems to have taken root. While they remained subjects of the Persian Empire for another century and a half, their loyalty was now suspect, their enthusiasm replaced by a sullen compliance. The grand bargain had been broken. The trust that had been carefully built over generations had been shattered in a single afternoon of royal fury. This simmering resentment would eventually boil over into open revolt. But for now, the Phoenicians returned to their ports, their pride wounded and their faith in their masters gone. The bitter taste of betrayal mingling with the salt of the sea. Long before their fateful service in the Persian navy, and a generation before Nebuchadnezzar's great siege, the Phoenicians likely undertook what may have been the single greatest feat of exploration in the ancient world. It was a journey so audacious, so far beyond the known horizons of their time, that its telling, centuries later, was met with widespread disbelief, even by the learned men who recorded it. The incredible story comes to us from the endlessly curious Greek historian Herodotus, and it concerns nothing less than the first circumnavigation of the entire continent of Africa. The tale begins not in Phoenicia itself, but in Egypt around the year 600 BCE. The Assyrian shadow had receded, and the Babylonian threat had not yet fully materialized. In this brief window of renewed independence, a dynamic and forward-thinking pharaoh named Necho II sat on the throne. Necho was a great builder and a man with a keen interest in expanding Egypt's commercial power. He began the colossal project of digging a canal to link the Nile with the Red Sea. hoping to create a direct waterway for trade to the south and east. It was this same global strategic mindset that led him to ponder a fundamental question of geography. Was the landmass they called Libya, the continent of Africa, surrounded on all sides by the sea? Or did it extend infinitely to the south? To find the answer, he turned to the only people in the world with the ships, the skill, and the sheer nerve to undertake such a voyage. The Phoenicians, as Herodotus tells the story. Necho II summoned a group of Phoenician captains and gave them a commission of breathtaking ambition. He ordered them to take their ships, not into the familiar Mediterranean, but south, out of the Red Sea, and into the unknown waters of what we now call the Indian Ocean. They were to follow the coastline, keeping the land on their right, and not turn back until they emerged from the Pillars of Hercules into the Mediterranean and returned to Egypt from the west. They were, in essence, being asked to sail off the map of the known world on a journey of unknown length and unimaginable danger. The Phoenician fleet set sail from a port near the modern-day Suez. They pushed south down the coast of East Africa into waters no Mediterranean sailor had ever seen. The logistics of such a journey were staggering. Their ships were far too small to carry provisions for a multi-year voyage. And so, they adopted a clever and patient strategy. As the seasons turned and autumn approached, Herodotus says, they would find a suitable spot on the coast, go ashore, and plant a field of wheat. They would then wait for the crop to grow and ripen, harvest their grain, resupply their ships, and then set sail once more, continuing their slow, methodical journey southward. This leapfrogging agricultural approach, while time-consuming, was a brilliant and practical solution to the problem of long-term sustenance. For 2 full years, they continued in this manner, sailing and farming their way down one coast of Africa and then up the other. Finally, in the 3rd year of their voyage, they passed through the Pillars of Hercules, the familiar gateway of the Strait of Gibraltar, and sailed east across the well-known waters of the Mediterranean, eventually returning to the Nile Delta. They had done it. They had proven that Africa was a continent that could be sailed around. But when they made their report to the Pharaoh's court, they included a detail so strange, so contrary to all known experience, that Herodotus himself, writing the story some 150 years later, felt compelled to add a personal note of skepticism. For my part, he wrote, I do not believe them, though others may. The unbelievable detail was this. The Phoenician sailors claimed that as they were rounding the southern tip of the continent, sailing west, they observed the midday sun on their right-hand side. To Herodotus and every other person living in the northern hemisphere, this was patent nonsense. From their perspective, whether in Greece, Egypt, or Persia, the sun always traveled across the southern part of the sky. To get from east to west, it always passed on your left if you were facing west. To say it was on their right was a claim that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of nature. And yet, this single, dismissed detail is precisely what convinces most modern historians that the voyage actually happened. It is a piece of evidence of stunning, unintentional authenticity. For a ship to be sailing west around what we now know is the Cape of Good Hope, it would be deep in the southern hemisphere. And for any observer in the southern hemisphere, the midday sun does indeed cross the northern part of the sky. Thus, for sailors on a westward course, the sun would have been, just as they reported, on their right. This is a subtle astronomical fact that no one in the ancient Mediterranean world could have possibly known or had any reason to invent. The fact that Herodotus found it unbelievable is the best proof of its veracity. Still, the voyage remains controversial, largely because of the silence of other sources. No Egyptian or Phoenician record of this monumental achievement has ever been found. And if the route was proven to be navigable, why was it not immediately exploited for trade? The answers are likely practical. The journey was simply too long and too dangerous to be commercially viable, and ancient records on papyrus rarely survive the ravages of time. While absolute proof may be lost to history, the internal logic of the story, the practical method of farming, and the astronomically correct, unbelievable detail about the sun is so powerful that it's hard to dismiss. It remains a tantalizing glimpse of the true extent of Phoenician seamanship, a quiet testament to a handful of anonymous sailors who, 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama, may have been the first to round the Horn of Africa and gaze upon two oceans at once. The spirit of exploration that may have carried Phoenician sailors around the entire continent of Africa did not die out with the decline of Tyre. It was inherited, nurtured, and amplified by their most successful descendants in the city of Carthage. While the circumnavigation sponsored by Pharaoh Necho remains a tantalizing legend preserved by a foreign historian, we possess a much more solid, almost first-hand account of another great voyage into the unknown. This journey, undertaken by the Carthaginians themselves, pushed south beyond the familiar Pillars of Hercules, down the mysterious and forbidding Atlantic coast of West Africa. It is the story of a great admiral, a massive expedition, and a terrifying encounter in the deep of a jungle. And it comes to us from the captain's own report, the voyage of Hanno the navigator. The expedition took place sometime around 500 BCE, a period when Carthage was flexing its muscles as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean, with their control of the sea lanes to Spain and Sardinia secure. Carthaginian leaders looked to a new frontier, the vast unknown coast of Africa beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Their motivations were a classic Phoenician blend of commercial ambition and strategic foresight. They hoped to discover new sources of gold and other valuable African commodities, bypassing the long, dangerous, and expensive trans-Saharan caravan routes controlled by desert tribes. At the same time, they sought to establish a permanent chain of colonies along the Atlantic coast, securing this new trade route for Carthage alone. This was no small scouting mission. The account of the voyage, known as the Periplus of Hanno, begins by stating the sheer scale of the undertaking. By decree of the Carthaginian Senate, Hanno set sail from the city with a fleet of 60 50-odd galleys. Aboard these ships were a staggering 30,000 men and women, provided with supplies and provisions for founding new cities. This was a major state-sponsored effort, an act of national ambition. It was less a voyage of pure discovery, and more a massive floating colonization project, designed to project Carthaginian power into the Atlantic. After passing through the Pillars of Hercules, the great fleet turned south, keeping the coast of Africa to its left. Hanno's first order of business was to establish the new colonies, securing the first leg of their journey. They founded several cities along the coast of what is now Morocco, leaving behind settlers and supplies. Pressing further south, they encountered a friendly, nomadic, pastoral tribe called the Lixitai. A crucial and intelligent diplomatic move was made. Hanno took several of the Lixite aboard his ships to act as interpreters, a decision that would prove vital as they moved into ever stranger lands. With their Lixite guides, the fleet continued its journey into the unknown. The landscape grew more alien. They sailed past a vast, barren desert that stretched to the coast, and then reached the mouth of a great river, which they reported was filled with crocodiles and hippopotamuses, an authentic detail that points to a journey far south into a truly African environment. As they sailed on, the world began to feel more menacing. One night, as they lay at anchor in a coastal bay, they saw that the land was alive with the light of countless fires. They could hear the eerie, unsettling sounds of flutes, the clash of cymbals, and the thunderous beat of drums echoing from the dark interior. A great terror fell upon the crews. Their interpreters warned them to leave quickly, explaining that this was the custom of the people of this land. Their sense of awe and fear would only grow. A few days later, they sailed past a mountain that was spouting immense torrents of fire that seemed to pour directly into the sea. By night, the mountain glowed with a terrifying light. They named it Theon Okuma, the chariot of the gods. Most modern historians believe Hanno and his men were witnessing a spectacular eruption of Mount Cameroon, a massive volcano on the coast of the Gulf of Guinea. For these sailors from the calm Mediterranean, it must have seemed as if they had sailed to the edge of the world and were now witnessing the forge of the gods themselves. The climax of the journey, and its most famous episode, came shortly after. They sailed into a deep bay, and at its end found an island. This island was inhabited, the report says, by savage people whose bodies were hairy and whom our interpreters call gorillai. This is the first known use of a word that would, 2 millennia later, be given to the great apes. Hanno's men pursued these creatures. The males, he reported, proved impossible to catch, escaping up steep cliffs and defending themselves by throwing stones. The Carthaginians did, however, manage to capture 3 of the females, but the creatures were so ferocious, biting and scratching their captors with such violence that the sailors could not transport them back to the ships alive. So they killed them, and in the scientific spirit of the age, they skinned them and carefully preserved the hairy hides to bring back to Carthage as proof of their discovery. Soon after this encounter, with their provisions beginning to run low, Hanno gave the order to turn back. The question that has fascinated historians ever since is, just how far did they get? The debate continues, but the evidence for a very long journey is compelling. The descriptions of crocodiles and hippos, the eruption of a great volcano, and the encounter with a species of great ape all point to a voyage that reached deep into the Gulf of Guinea, perhaps as far as modern Gabon. If so, it was an incredible feat of navigation and endurance, a journey of thousands of miles down a completely uncharted coast. Hanno's own account, his periplus, was inscribed on a stone tablet and dedicated in the temple of Baal Haman in Carthage upon his return. The original is lost, but a short Greek translation survived, a tantalizing summary of one of history's greatest voyages. The shaggy gorilla skins he brought back were reportedly still on display in the temple centuries later. A final, tangible piece of evidence from the edge of the world, even as Carthaginian explorers like Hanno were pushing the boundaries of the known world into the Atlantic. Back in the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, a new and formidable commercial rival was rising to prominence. They were not a unified empire like the ones the Phoenicians had dealt with in the East, but a scattered collection of fiercely independent and competitive city-states, much like the Phoenicians themselves. They were brilliant sailors, savvy traders, and ambitious colonizers. They were the Greeks, and the centuries-long encounter between these two great seafaring peoples would come to define the history and the very character of the ancient Mediterranean. Their relationship was one of profound complexity, a rich and often volatile mixture of bitter rivalry, grudging respect, and deep cultural cross-pollination. They were, in many ways, two sides of the same coin. Both peoples were born from mountainous, geographically constrained homelands that pushed them inexorably toward the sea. Both were organized not into a single nation, but into a constellation of proud and quarrelsome city-states, Tyre and Sidon, finding their mirrors in Corinth and Athens. Both built their prosperity not on conquering vast tracts of land, but on maritime trade and the founding of colonies. It was precisely these similarities that made their rivalry so intense. They were competing for the very same things: the same strategic harbors, the same sources of metal, the same markets for their goods. The Mediterranean, it seemed, was not big enough for both of them. This competition played out most dramatically in a great race for colonization that unfolded between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. As Phoenician ships were establishing their string of pearls in North Africa and Spain, Greek colonists began their own explosive expansion. They founded a dense network of new cities in southern Italy, a region that became so thoroughly Hellenized it was known as Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. They settled the rich volcanic island of Sicily and pushed as far as the coasts of modern-day France and Spain. The result was a Mediterranean map that became a complex checkerboard of Greek and Phoenician spheres of influence, their settlements often existing in close, watchful proximity to one another. The flashpoint, the primary arena where this Cold War most often turned hot, was the magnificent and strategically vital island of Sicily. Situated at the very center of the sea, Sicily controlled the passage between the eastern and western basins. It was a prize neither side was willing to concede. The Greeks established powerful colonies like Syracuse and Akragas on the eastern and southern coasts of the island, while the Phoenicians, and later their Carthaginian heirs, held the formidable western strongholds of Motia, Panormus, and Saguntum. For nearly 3 centuries, the island was the stage for a series of brutal and exhausting conflicts known as the Sicilian Wars. A near constant state of warfare as the Greek and Carthaginian cities battled for control of the island's fertile lands and trade routes. And yet, for all their conflict, these two peoples were deeply entangled. They were each other's most important trading partners and most immediate cultural neighbors. The greatest Phoenician gift, of course, was the one that enabled the Greeks to record their own history and literature: the alphabet. But the exchange went both ways. During what historians call the Orientalizing period of Greek art, their pottery and sculpture were suddenly flooded with Eastern motifs, like the Sphinx, the griffin, and intricate floral patterns. These designs arrived in Greece in the holds of Phoenician ships, on exquisitely carved ivories and ornate bronze bowls that were highly prized by the Greek aristocracy. In turn, later Phoenician art shows a clear and powerful influence from the elegant naturalistic styles of their Greek rivals. This cultural borrowing extended even to the heavens. When the Greeks encountered the Phoenician gods, they did not simply dismiss them. They sought to understand them by finding parallels within their own pantheon. They recognized in the figure of Melkart, the heroic patron god of Tyre, who died and was reborn each year, a reflection of their own mighty Heracles. They saw in the worship of the great goddess Astarte many of the qualities of their own goddess of love, Aphrodite. This process of religious syncretism reveals a deep and prolonged interaction, a recognition of a shared humanity beneath the different names and rituals. So why, despite these deep connections, did they remain so distinct, so often opposed? The answer may lie in a fundamental difference in their worldviews. The Phoenicians were, first and foremost, a practical and commercial people. Their genius was in business, logistics, and manufacturing. They were famously secretive, guarding their trade routes and manufacturing techniques as corporate secrets. Herodotus often complained that it was nearly impossible to get a straight answer from a Phoenician captain about where he had been or where he was going. Their surviving texts are not epic poems or philosophical treatises, but mundane, though vital ledgers, contracts, and funerary inscriptions. Their state was an oligarchy, run by a council of rich merchants and magistrates. The Greeks, while also skilled traders, possessed a different kind of intellectual spirit. They developed a deep curiosity about the world for its own sake. They invented history, drama, and philosophy. They sought to understand and explain the cosmos, not just through myth, but through logic and inquiry. They celebrated the ideal of the polis, the community of citizens, and experimented with radical new political ideas like democracy. They were inquisitive, argumentative, and loquacious, where the Phoenicians were pragmatic and taciturn. One could imagine a Greek and a Phoenician captain encountering a new island. The Phoenician would immediately assess its harbors, resources, and market potential, while the Greek would want to know the names of the local gods, the nature of their political system, and what stories they told about the creation of the world. They were the two great pillars of the Iron Age Mediterranean, rivals and partners who together built a connected world, each providing what the other lacked. It was the most consequential and productive rivalry the ancient world had ever known. The long and complex rivalry between the Phoenicians and the Greeks was, for centuries, a struggle between relative equals. But in the middle of the 4th century BCE, a force emerged from the mountainous north of Greece that would shatter this balance of power forever. A young and brilliant Macedonian king named Alexander, having inherited a united Greece and an unquenchable thirst for glory, crossed into Asia to challenge the full might of the Persian Empire. As he marched his invincible army south along the Levantine coast, his strategy was to secure all the port cities, thereby neutralizing the Persian fleet, which he knew was largely Phoenician. One by one, the cities of Arwad, Byblos, and even the great city of Sidon, still nursing its resentment against the Persians, opened their gates to the young conqueror. But one city stood defiant, a prize Alexander had to take, and a symbol of resistance he was determined to break. The ancient, proud, and seemingly impregnable island fortress of Tyre. When Alexander and his army arrived in 332 BCE, he sent heralds to the city with a demand for its surrender. His stated request was a clever piece of political theater. He wished to enter the city peacefully to offer a sacrifice in the great temple of its god, Melkart, whom Alexander, like all Greeks, identified with his own mythical ancestor, Heracles. For the Tyrians, this was an unacceptable proposition. They were the last bastion of true Phoenician power, confident in the sea and the stone walls that had held off the mighty Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years. To allow Alexander inside would be to acknowledge him as their master. They sent back a polite but firm refusal. They would be his allies, but not his subjects. He was welcome to sacrifice at the older temple to Melkart on the mainland, they offered, but the island city was sovereign. For Alexander, a man whose entire legend was built upon never being denied, this was an intolerable insult. The lines were drawn. Alexander was a keen student of history. He knew all about Nebuchadnezzar's failed siege and the frustrating limitations of a land army against a sea power. He decided he would succeed where the Babylonian king had failed. He would build another causeway, but he would do it with Macedonian engineering, speed, and ruthless determination. He commanded his army to demolish the old mainland portion of Tyre, using its stones, rubble, and timber as the raw material for his great mole. The work began at a ferocious pace. A land-based army attempting to pave a road across the sea, 200 feet wide, inching its way towards the island. The Tyrians, with their powerful navy and generations of experience in maritime warfare, responded with fierce and effective resistance. Their ships, nimble and quick, would sail close to the causeway, their decks mounted with stone-throwing catapults, raining down a punishing barrage on the Macedonian work crews. They sent divers, swimming silently underwater at night, to pull away the wooden piles that stabilized the structure. Their most spectacular counterattack came when the mole was nearing the city. They took a large old ship, packed it with pitch, sulfur, and every combustible material they could find, and weighted its stern so that its bow rose high in the air like a great fire-breathing monster. On a day with a favorable wind, they towed it towards the causeway, set it ablaze, and aimed it directly at the two enormous wooden siege towers Alexander had constructed at the head of his mole. The fire ship crashed into the towers with a terrifying roar, and the entire structure was consumed in a spectacular inferno, undoing months of Macedonian labor in a single afternoon. A lesser general might have given up, but Alexander was adaptable. The fire ship attack taught him a crucial lesson. He could not defeat a sea power without a sea power of his own. He paused the construction of the mole and traveled north to the city of Sidon. There he put his diplomatic skills to work. He gathered the fleets of the Phoenician cities that had already surrendered to him: Sidon, Byblos, and Awad. He summoned more ships from his allies in Rhodes and Cyprus. In a remarkably short time, he had assembled a massive armada of over 200 warships. He'd returned to Tyre not just as a general, but as an admiral. The Phoenician civil war was now complete. The fleets of Sidon and Byblos were now preparing to attack their sister city, Tyre. With this new fleet, Alexander changed the game entirely. He now commanded the sea. He sailed his armada to Tyre and decisively defeated the Tyrian navy in a sea battle, then used his ships to establish a total blockade of the city's two harbors. The island was now completely cut off. Its greatest advantage, its connection to the sea, now turned into a prison wall. Under the protection of his fleet, the Macedonians completed the causeway. Alexander rolled his colossal siege engines, towers reportedly 150 feet high, taller than the city walls, armed with catapults and assault bridges, along the mole and up to the city's ramparts. For weeks, the city endured a relentless bombardment. Finally, a section of the southern wall was breached. The final assault was a scene of horrific carnage. Alexander, always leading from the front, was among the first to cross the gangplanks from a siege tower into the city. The Macedonians poured through the breach. The Tyrians, knowing their cause was lost, fought with desperate courage for their homes, their families, and their city's long history of freedom. But they were overwhelmed. Alexander, enraged by the 7-month siege and the heavy losses his army had sustained, unleashed his soldiers. Some 8,000 Tyrians are said to have been killed in the final brutal fighting. In the aftermath, Alexander's fury was not sated. He ordered 2,000 more Tyrian men of military age to be executed, a final horrifying spectacle of mass crucifixion along the shores. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants, mostly women and children, were rounded up and sold into slavery. The great city was looted, burned, and left a ghost town. Alexander's causeway had physically and permanently connected the island to the mainland, destroying the very geography that had been its shield for millennia. The siege of Tyre was over. The age of Phoenician independence was finished. The brutal sack of Tyre was more than the end of a city. It was a violent sea change for the entire ancient world. Alexander's conquest did not just topple stone walls. It irrevocably shattered the old order of independent city-states and distant, loosely held empires. In its place rose a new, glittering, and thoroughly Greek-dominated civilization that historians now call the Hellenistic world. For the Phoenician homeland, the centuries that followed Alexander's death would be a long and gentle twilight, a slow, inevitable process of cultural absorption and transformation. Their political independence had been extinguished in a storm of violence. Their cultural distinctiveness would now slowly dissolve in the rising tide of Hellenism. When Alexander the Great died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BCE, his vast, newly conquered empire, lacking a clear heir, was torn apart by his ambitious generals in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Wars of the Successors. For the cities of Phoenicia, this was a disastrous development. Their strategic location on the coast and their invaluable naval resources made them one of the most highly prized and fiercely contested territories in the fractured empire. For the better part of a century, the Phoenician homeland became a perpetual battleground, passed back and forth in a deadly tug-of-war between the two most powerful successor states, the Ptolemaic Kingdom, based in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, based in Syria and Mesopotamia. This era of constant warfare stood in stark contrast to the relative stability they had endured under the Persians, leaving their cities damaged and their populations weary. Out of this chaos, a new cultural force began to reshape their world. Hellenization was the process by which Greek language, customs, art, politics, and philosophy spread and blended with the local cultures across the lands of Alexander's former empire. It was the first great wave of cultural globalization, and for the ancient and deeply rooted civilization of the Phoenicians, its effects were profound and permanent. The most immediate and powerful agent of this change was language. Koine Greek, a common, simplified dialect of Greek, became the official language of government, law, and international commerce. while the native Phoenician language, a Semitic tongue closely related to Hebrew, continued to be spoken in homes and on the streets for centuries. Any person with ambition, any merchant, scholar, or official, had to become fluent in Greek. Inscriptions on public buildings and tombs, which had once been exclusively in Phoenician, became bilingual, and then, over the generations, exclusively Greek. The very look and feel of their ancient cities began to change. Wealthy patrons and Hellenistic kings remodeled the old ports to resemble a proper Greek polis. They built gleaming marble theaters for the performance of Greek plays, public gymnasia, where the sons of the elite would receive a Greek education in rhetoric, athletics, and philosophy, and sprawling colonnaded agoras, the open public squares that were the heart of Greek civic life. The traditional Phoenician system of monarchy, which had already been weakened, was often replaced with Greek-style city councils and elected magistrates. A citizen of Sidon or Byblos might now find himself participating in a political system whose structure would have been perfectly familiar to a citizen of Athens. Even their gods began to speak with a Greek accent. The process of religious syncretism, which had begun centuries earlier, now accelerated. The great god Baal-Hamon was increasingly identified with Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. The beloved goddess Astarte, queen of heaven, became ever more closely entwined with Aphrodite, and Tyre's patron hero god, Melkart, was now almost universally known by his Greek name, Heracles. The old temples were often renovated or entirely rebuilt according to the principles of Greek architecture, with elegant columns and classical proportions. The ancient Phoenician faith did not vanish overnight, but it began to wear a Greek mask, its rituals and myths reinterpreted to fit within the new cultural landscape. Even people's names began to change as Phoenician families gave their children Greek names to better fit into the new society. But this was not a simple story of cultural erasure. The Phoenicians were, as always, masters of adaptation. Their culture was not so much wiped out as it was fused with the new Hellenistic mainstream. They remained brilliant mariners and merchants. They simply conducted their business in Greek. The ports of Tyre, which was gradually rebuilt and repopulated, Sidon and Byblos remained vital hubs of Mediterranean trade. And as they absorbed the culture of the Greeks, they also began to contribute to it. Having become part of the Greek-speaking intellectual world, Phoenician cities began to produce their own renowned philosophers, scientists, and writers. Perhaps the most famous example of this fusion is Zeno of Citium. Born in a city of Phoenician origin on the island of Cyprus, Zeno would later move to Athens and found one of the most influential and enduring schools of Greek thought, Stoicism. This leads to a quiet and unanswerable historical mystery. When exactly did the Phoenicians disappear? There was no final battle, no decree that ended their existence. They simply, over the course of many generations, faded from the historical record as a distinct people. A person living in Tyre in the 2nd century BCE was likely bilingual, speaking Phoenician at home with their family and Greek in the marketplace. They might have a Phoenician name and a Greek name. They might worship Melkart Heracles. The identity of Phoenician slowly transformed from a vibrant, independent cultural and political reality into something more like a regional or ancestral identity. By the time the Romans arrived to absorb the region into their own growing empire, the process of Hellenization was all but complete. The unique culture that had given the world the alphabet, the color purple, and the courage to sail off the map had not died, but had been peacefully assimilated, its streams flowing into and becoming indistinguishable from the great river of Hellenistic civilization. As the old heartland of Phoenicia was slowly and peacefully absorbed into the great cultural melting pot of the Hellenistic world, a new, far more powerful heart began to beat in the west. The new city, Carthage, was no longer a mere colonial outpost, while the mother cities of Tyre and Sidon became provincial subjects of Greek-speaking kings in Egypt and Syria. Carthage, protected by its immense distance and its rapidly growing power, had evolved into a magnificent and formidable empire in its own right. The torch of the Phoenician civilization had been passed, and in the hands of the Carthaginians, it would burn with a dazzling, aggressive, and fiercely independent new light. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, Carthage was no longer a monarchy ruled by the descendants of a fugitive queen. It had matured into a sophisticated, oligarchic republic, a state run by and for its immensely wealthy merchant aristocracy. At the head of the government were two annually elected chief magistrates, known as suffetes, a title that shares its linguistic root with the Hebrew word for judge. These were not kings with absolute power, but more like consuls or dual prime ministers, presiding over the state's affairs. The true center of power resided in a senate, a council of several hundred elders drawn from the city's most powerful and ancient commercial families. It was in this chamber that the grand strategy of the Republic was forged, where treaties were debated, and where every foreign policy decision was ultimately weighed on the scales of profit and loss. To prevent any one general or politician from growing too powerful and becoming a tyrant, they also created a powerful judicial body, the Court of 104, which held commanders and officials accountable for their actions. It was a system designed for stability, designed to protect the interests of the commercial elite, and it proved remarkably effective for centuries. Under the guidance of this merchant senate, Carthage built an empire that was a true reflection of its Phoenician heritage. It was not a contiguous land empire like that of Persia or later Rome. It was a maritime and commercial hegemony, a network of territories, vassals, and allies bound together by the power of the Carthaginian navy. Their imperial holdings had several distinct tiers. At its core was a large and highly fertile agricultural territory in what is now Tunisia, a hinterland that they controlled directly. This was a crucial advantage that Tyre had never possessed. Carthage grew its own food, giving it a level of self-sufficiency and a demographic base that made it far more resilient than its mother city. Beyond this core territory, they exercised direct and often harsh control over the key islands of the Western Mediterranean. They dominated the western half of Sicily, all of Sardinia and Corsica, and the small but strategic Balearic Islands. These were not mere trading partners. They were provinces to be exploited for their rich resources, especially grain and metals, and their populations were subjects of Carthaginian rule. Further west, they inherited and expanded the old Phoenician sphere of influence in southern Spain, taking control of the priceless silver mines. The Strait of Gibraltar, the ancient Pillars of Hercules, became their private toll gate. The Carthaginian navy patrolled it relentlessly, and any unauthorized foreign trading ship, especially a Greek one, that dared to pass through, was likely to be seized or simply rammed and sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. This dominion was maintained by a military that was unique in the ancient world. The navy was the pride and joy of the Republic. It was a massive state-of-the-art fleet centered on the Quinquerem, a formidable war galley with 5 banks of oarsmen, the battleship of its day. The navy was crewed and commanded by Carthaginian citizens, for they understood that control of the sea was the bedrock of their entire existence. Their army, however, operated on a completely different principle. Believing their own citizens to be too valuable as merchants, administrators, and sailors to be wasted in the infantry, the Carthaginians outsourced their land warfare almost entirely. Their army was a vast multinational and professional mercenary force. This army was a colorful and formidable tapestry of the peoples of the Western Mediterranean. Its greatest strength was the incomparable light cavalry provided by their neighbors, the Numidians of North Africa, who were arguably the finest horsemen in the ancient world. The heavy infantry corps came from the Libyans they had subjugated. From their Spanish territories came fierce and reliable warriors, and from the Balearic Islands came their famous slingers, men who had been trained from childhood to hurl stones with lethal speed and accuracy. When they needed more manpower, they would hire whole tribes of Celts and Gauls from across the Alps. This diverse force was led always by a Carthaginian general from one of the great aristocratic families. This system gave Carthage access to a vast and varied pool of specialized military talent, but it also had critical weaknesses. The loyalty of mercenaries was only as strong as the last payroll, and it created a dangerous disconnect between the citizens at home and the foreign army fighting the Republic's wars. What was this Punic culture like? Because the Romans would later be so thorough in their destruction of the city, we see Carthage almost entirely through the hostile lens of its enemies. But we can piece together a picture of a society that was culturally conservative, deeply religious, and intensely focused on its commercial mission. They spoke Punic, a dialect of the old Phoenician tongue, and wrote with the same alphabet. They worshipped the familiar gods, with Baal-Hamon as their chief deity, and a goddess named Tanit, rising to a position of prominence even above Astarte. And it seems the controversial rite of the Tophet, the sacrifice of children in times of crisis, was a practice that endured in Carthage long after it had faded in the homeland, a sign perhaps of their cultural isolation and conservatism. To their Greek and Roman rivals, they were a stereotype, fabulously wealthy, but also greedy, treacherous, and cruel. The Latin phrase punica fides, or Punic faith, became a common term for utter perfidy. While this was surely propaganda, it reflected their reputation as secretive, hard-nosed, and brutally effective business rivals. By the dawn of the 3rd century BCE, Carthage was the undisputed queen of the Western Mediterranean. But on the Italian peninsula, another republic, one built on the ideal of the citizen soldier, had just finished uniting its own domain. The two rising powers, Rome and Carthage, were now staring at each other across the narrow sea. The stage was set for a conflict that would decide the fate of the world. For a long time, the two great republics of the Western Mediterranean, Rome and Carthage, maintained a cautious and respectful distance from one another. They were aware of each other's power, and a series of treaties had been signed over the centuries, carefully delineating their respective spheres of influence. Carthage would have its sea, and Rome would have its land. But the island of Sicily, that perennial flashpoint of the ancient world, a jewel coveted by all, would finally draw these two rising superpowers into a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity. This was the beginning of the Punic Wars, a titanic struggle that would last for more than a century and could only end with one of them utterly destroyed. From the perspective of the Carthaginian Senate, the conflict began not as a grand clash of civilizations, but as a messy and rather undignified local dispute that the Romans had no business getting involved in. A band of rogue Italian mercenaries, calling themselves the Mamertines, or Sons of Mars, had treacherously seized the city of Messana, on the northeastern tip of Sicily, right across the narrow strait from Italy. When the powerful Greek city of Syracuse moved to crush them, these mercenaries, in a panic, sent out appeals for help to both of the region's great powers, Carthage and Rome. For Carthage, this was a familiar game. Sicily was their backyard. They responded immediately, sending a garrison to occupy Messana's citadel, ostensibly to protect the Mamertines, but in reality to secure a strategic foothold controlling the vital strait. It was a standard, low-risk power play. They were therefore shocked and deeply offended when the Roman Senate, after a long and contentious debate, voted to intervene. To the wealthy oligarchs in Carthage, the Romans were upstart landlubbers, a people of farmers and soldiers who had no navy and no understanding of the sea. Their interference in Sicily was a breach of protocol, an audacious and unwelcome intrusion into Carthaginian affairs. The war that began in 264 BCE was, at its outset, a classic clash of military doctrines, a battle between a whale and an elephant. Carthage was the whale, an undisputed master of the sea. Their vast and professional navy, the product of centuries of Phoenician experience, was the most powerful in the world. Their strategy was simple and seemed foolproof. They would control the sea lanes, blockade the coast of Sicily, and let the Roman legions, who were foolish enough to cross over to the island, wither on the vine, cut off from their supplies and reinforcements. Rome was the elephant, a lumbering land power whose strength lay in its disciplined, heavily armed citizen legions, which were all but unbeatable in a pitched battle on land. But without a fleet, their army was an island. The Carthaginian Senate, confident in their naval supremacy, likely viewed the coming conflict with a certain arrogance, expecting a short and profitable war. What happened next sent a wave of disbelief and horror through the grand houses of Carthage. The Romans, with a terrifying display of grim determination and industrial might, decided to challenge the whale in its own element. According to legend, they captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquereme and, using it as a blueprint, reverse-engineered it. In a staggeringly short time, their shipyards produced a massive fleet of over 100 warships. The Carthaginians may have scoffed at these clumsy, hastily built copies, crewed by inexperienced Roman sailors. But the Romans had a secret weapon, an invention of brutish genius called the corvus, or the raven. It was a huge, heavy boarding plank, hinged to the front of the ship, and armed with a heavy spike on its underside. The Roman strategy was revolutionary. They would sail directly at a Carthaginian vessel, drop the corvus so that its spike slammed down and embedded in the enemy's deck. And then, with the two ships locked together, their legionaries would storm across and turn the naval battle into a land battle. The first major test of this new reality came at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE. The Carthaginian admiral, expecting an easy victory, sailed his fleet out with casual confidence, not even bothering to maintain a tight formation. He was met, not with a conventional naval engagement, but with a swarm of Roman ships that slammed into his own, dropped their terrifying bridges, and disgorged waves of armored sword-wielding soldiers onto his decks. The skilled Carthaginian sailors were no match for Roman legionaries in hand-to-hand combat. The result was a stunning and humiliating defeat. Ship after ship was captured. For the first time in its history, Carthage had been beaten at sea. The whale had been harpooned. The war devolved into a long, brutal, and ruinously expensive stalemate that dragged on for more than 20 years, mostly fought on the island of Sicily. In the later stages of the conflict, Carthage finally found a general of true genius in Hamilcar Barca, the father of the legendary Hannibal. Hamilcar took command of the beleaguered Carthaginian forces in Sicily and waged a brilliant campaign of guerrilla warfare from the island's mountainous interior, launching lightning raids and avoiding pitched battles, bleeding the Romans year after year. Yet, tragically for Hamilcar and for Carthage, his genius was undermined by his own government. The merchant senate back home, weary of the war's spiraling costs, and perhaps fearful of Hamilcar's growing fame and influence, consistently denied him the fresh troops and funds he needed to deliver a decisive blow. They were attempting to manage a world war as if it were a quarterly budget, a fatal miscalculation. In 241 BCE, the Romans, though nearly bankrupt themselves, gathered their remaining strength and wealth for one last push. A new Roman fleet, funded by the private fortunes of its senators, met and utterly destroyed the last Carthaginian relief fleet at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. With its navy annihilated and Hamilcar's army now permanently cut off, Carthage had no choice but to sue for peace. The terms were crushing. They were forced to abandon Sicily entirely and pay a war indemnity of such a staggering quantity of silver that it would cripple their economy for years. For Carthage, the war was a catastrophe born of arrogance. They had fatally underestimated Rome's resolve, and in the heart of their best general, Hamilcar, a bitter and personal hatred for the city that had defeated and humiliated his people, began to grow. A dark legacy he would pass on to his sons. The humiliation of the First Punic War left a deep and lasting wound in the Carthaginian psyche, and nowhere did it burn more fiercely than in the heart of their greatest general, Hamilcar Barca. An ancient story, which may be a legend, but feels emotionally true, tells of Hamilcar in his final years leading his 9-year-old son to a smoky altar of Baal Hammon in his Spanish camp. There, he made the boy place his small hand on the sacred stone and swear a solemn, unbreakable oath that for all the days of his life, he would never be a friend to the Roman people. That boy's name was Hannibal, and he would honor his father's oath with a terrifying and brilliant vengeance that would bring Rome to its knees and etch his name into history as one of the greatest military commanders who ever lived. After his father's death, Hannibal inherited command of the new Carthaginian Empire in Spain, a private fiefdom for the Barca family forged to rebuild their power. It was from here, in 218 BCE, that he deliberately ignited the Second Punic War. He laid siege to and conquered the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Roman ally, an act he knew Rome could not ignore. When Roman envoys arrived in Carthage demanding that Hannibal be handed over to them for justice, the Carthaginian Senate swept up in a new wave of confidence and anti-Roman fervor refused. The second, and far more terrible, war had begun. Hannibal knew that Carthage could not win a naval war against Rome's now superior fleet. He also knew that another long, grinding war fought in Sicily was a losing proposition. He conceived of a strategy so audacious, so far beyond the realms of conventional military thinking, that it must have seemed like madness. He would not wait for the Romans to come to him. He would take the war to them in their own homeland of Italy. He assembled his vast mercenary army, fierce Iberian infantry, elite Numidian horsemen, Gallic warriors, and his corps of disciplined African veterans, and began an epic march north from Spain. And with him, he brought his famous secret weapon, a contingent of war elephants. The journey has become the stuff of legend. After fighting his way across the Rhone River in southern Gaul, he turned his army toward the Alps, a barrier that no army of this size had ever dared to cross. The ordeal that followed was a nightmare of ice and stone. The narrow mountain passes were death traps, with hostile mountain tribes rolling boulders down upon his men from the cliffs above. The autumn snows began to fall, burying the treacherous paths and freezing his soldiers, most of whom had grown up under the warm African sun. His great elephants, terrified and clumsy on the icy ledges, would slip and tumble thousands of feet into the ravines below. By the time he finally descended, 15 days later, into the plains of northern Italy, his army was a shadow of its former self, having lost perhaps half its men and most of its elephants. But the force that emerged was hardened by the ordeal, and most importantly, it was now deep inside enemy territory, a dagger pointed at the heart of Rome. The Romans, in a state of shock and panic, sent their legions north to confront the invader. They met Hannibal at the Trebia River, and he crushed them. They tried to trap him the following year at Lake Trasimene, and Hannibal, in a brilliant display of tactical genius, laid a perfect ambush, trapping an entire Roman consular army against the shore of the lake and annihilating it in the morning mist. The road to Rome now lay open, but it was the year after, in 216 BCE, on a dusty plain in southern Italy, near a town called Cannae, that Hannibal would execute his masterpiece, the most perfect tactical victory in military history. The Romans, humiliated and furious, had mustered the largest army their republic had ever fielded, some 80,000 men, with the simple and brutal instruction to find Hannibal and crush him through sheer weight of numbers. Hannibal, with a smaller and more diverse army, drew up his forces in an unconventional formation. He placed his weakest troops, his Gallic allies, in the center, allowing them to bulge forward in a shallow crescent, while his elite, veteran African infantry were held back on the flanks. As the battle began, the massive, deep formation of the Roman legions charged forward with unstoppable force, just as Hannibal had intended. The weak Gallic center buckled and began to fall back. The Roman commanders, sensing victory, ordered their men to push harder into the collapsing center. But it was a trap. As the legions pressed deeper, Hannibal's veteran infantry on the wings wheeled inward, slamming into the exposed Roman flanks. At the same time, Hannibal's vastly superior Numidian cavalry, having chased the Roman horsemen from the field, circled around and attacked the legions from behind. The trap was sprung. The entire Roman army was encircled. What followed was not a battle, but an industrial-scale slaughter. Penned in from all sides, unable to maneuver, the Roman soldiers were cut down where they stood. By the end of the day, as many as 70,000 Romans lay dead on the field. It was the darkest day in the history of the Republic. After Cani, Rome was prostrate, its armies shattered. Why did Hannibal not march on the city and end the war? It is one of history's great unanswered questions. Perhaps he lacked the siege equipment to take such a massive, fortified city. Perhaps his true aim was not to destroy Rome itself, but to break its confederation by proving that Rome could not protect its allies. But most critically, the cautious merchant Senate back in Carthage, perhaps jealous of his power, failed to send the reinforcements he desperately needed to finish the job. Rome, meanwhile, adopted a new and painful strategy. They would no longer fight Hannibal in open battle. For the next 13 years, Hannibal and his army would march up and down Italy, undefeated, a terrifying, ghostly presence, but unable to land the final killing blow. He was a master tactician who had won every battle, but he was slowly, inexorably losing the war. He was a solitary genius, haunted by his oath, betrayed by his own people, and unable, in the end, to break the iron will of Rome. For 15 long years, Hannibal had haunted the Italian peninsula like a ghost of vengeance, a brilliant and undefeated general who won every battle but could not win the war. The Romans, unable to exorcise this spectre from their homeland by force, finally produced a general who understood that the only way to kill a ghost is to attack the body it belongs to. That general was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and his audacious strategy was to bypass Hannibal entirely and take the war to the gates of Carthage itself. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed a Roman army in North Africa. The plan worked exactly as he had hoped. The Carthaginian Senate, panicked at the sight of Roman legions burning their fields and threatening their city, did the one thing that could save Rome. They recalled Hannibal from Italy. One can only imagine the moment when Hannibal, after more than a decade of campaigning, his hair now streaked with grey, received the order. He had brought the most powerful republic in the world to the brink of collapse. And now, with the final victory still eluding him, he was being called home not as a conqueror, but as a last, desperate line of defense. The final showdown came in 202 BCE on a dusty plain near a town called Zama. It was a clash of titans. Hannibal, leading a hastily assembled army of raw mercenaries, and his handful of remaining grizzled veterans from the Italian campaign, faced Scipio, who commanded a disciplined and battle-hardened Roman force. Scipio had spent years studying Hannibal's tactics, and he came prepared. When Hannibal unleashed his war elephants, the Romans simply blew trumpets and opened lanes in their formation, allowing the terrified beasts to run harmlessly through. For the first and only time in his career, Hannibal was tactically outmaneuvered and decisively defeated. The battle was a rout. The war was over. The peace that followed was a crushing humiliation for Carthage. They were stripped of all their overseas territories, including their precious empire in Spain. Their formidable navy was scuttled, reduced to a token force of just 10 ships. They were forbidden from ever again waging war without Rome's explicit permission, and they were saddled with a staggering war indemnity in silver, designed to keep them impoverished for generations. Carthage was no longer an empire. It was a disarmed and broken client state, living entirely at the mercy of Rome. In the half-century that followed, the Carthaginians, stripped of their military ambitions, did what their Phoenician ancestors had always done best. They turned to trade. With a remarkable display of resilience and commercial energy, they rebuilt their economy. So successful were they that they managed to pay off the crippling Roman war debt ahead of schedule. But this very success was, in the end, their doom. In Rome, this economic recovery was not seen as a marvel of resilience, but as a sign of a resurgent and unforgivable threat. A paranoid conviction began to grow among the Roman elite, a belief that true security could only be achieved through the complete and utter obliteration of their old rival. The voice of this obsession belonged to a grim and influential senator, Cato the Elder. For years, he ended every speech he gave in the Roman Senate, no matter the topic under discussion, with the same 5 chilling words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, Rome found the pretext it had been waiting for. Carthage's aggressive neighbor, the Numidian kingdom, which was a Roman ally, had been repeatedly raiding Carthaginian territory. Bound by the treaty, Carthage appealed to Rome time and again to intervene, but Rome did nothing. Finally, pushed to the brink, the Carthaginians raised an army to defend their borders, an act that technically violated the treaty. Rome immediately declared war. When a massive Roman army landed in Africa, the Carthaginians, knowing they stood no chance, attempted to surrender immediately. They handed over hundreds of their own children as hostages, and in a final act of submission, they turned over all of their weapons and armor, leaving their city completely defenseless. It was only then, after the city had been stripped of its children and its arms, that the Roman consuls delivered the final unthinkable ultimatum. The people of Carthage, they commanded, must abandon their great city forever and resettle at least 10 miles inland, far from the sea. For a seafaring people whose entire identity, history, and prosperity were bound to the rhythms of the waves and the traffic of the harbor, this was not a demand for relocation. It was a demand for cultural suicide. It was a sentence of slow, agonizing death as farmers in the dust. Faced with this impossible choice, the people of Carthage found a final reserve of courage. The gates of the city were barred. They would die as Carthaginians in the city their ancestors had built, rather than live as refugees in their own land. The final siege of Carthage was one of history's most heroic and tragic last stands. The entire city became a frantic workshop. Citizens tore down public buildings for timber and metal. The city's women famously cut off their long hair to be braided into ropes for the catapults. For 3 years, this unarmed city held off the full might of the Roman legions. But the end was inevitable. In 146 BCE, a new Roman commander, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the man who had defeated Hannibal, finally breached the walls. What followed was an apocalypse. For 6 days and 6 nights, the Romans fought their way through the city, house by house, slaughtering the inhabitants. When the fighting finally stopped, the 50,000 citizens who remained from a population of nearly 500,000 were rounded up and sold into slavery. Then the final command was given. For 17 days, Roman demolition crews worked to systematically level the city, to pull down its temples, its libraries, and its homes, until nothing was left but rubble. A later legend, which most historians now doubt, but which captures the pitiless spirit of the act, claimed the Romans then plowed the ruins and sowed the earth with salt, a final curse to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. The destruction was total. Rome had not just defeated its enemy, it had erased it from the earth. The ghost of Hannibal was finally laid to rest, buried forever beneath the ashes of his home. The final agonizing destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE feels like a full stop, a definitive and brutal ending to our story. With the ancient Phoenician homeland having already been absorbed into the great Hellenistic monarchies, and its most powerful daughter city now a smoking ruin, the historical narrative seems to go silent. The Phoenicians, as a distinct political and cultural entity, appear to have been erased from the world. But a people are more than just their cities and their states. Their true legacy is not always found in the ruins of their temples or the annals of their kings. It is woven, often invisibly, into the very fabric of the civilizations that come after. The Phoenicians may have vanished from the political map, but their ghosts still sail with us today. Their influence felt in the words we write, the world we trade in, and even in the very blood of the Mediterranean people. Their most tangible and undeniable legacy is the one you are using at this very moment, the alphabet. This simple, elegant, and revolutionary technology, refined in the bustling ports of Tyre and Sidon, was their greatest gift to humanity. From their original 22 consonant signs, a direct line of descent can be traced through the Greek alphabet, the Etruscan alphabet, and finally, to the Latin alphabet used to write English and countless other languages across the globe. Another branch of their script, Aramaic, became the ancestor of modern Hebrew and Arabic. Nearly every person on earth who uses an alphabet to read or write is a distant intellectual heir to these ancient Canaanite sea traders. Every time you read a sign, send a message, or lose yourself in a book, you are using a piece of mental software that was developed and popularized by them 3,000 years ago. It is a legacy so profound and so ubiquitous that we rarely even notice it is there. Their influence also laid the foundations of our modern global economy. They were the world's first true globalists, the first to demonstrate that a nation's power and prosperity could be built not on the conquest of land, but on the control of the sea and the connections of commerce. They perfected the art of the middleman, the logistics of long-distance shipping, and the science of turning raw materials into high-value manufactured goods. The vast, interconnected marketplace they created across the Mediterranean was a prototype for the world we live in today. The complex international trade they managed would have been impossible without sophisticated business practices. They were almost certainly pioneers in the development of maritime law, commercial contracts, and joint stock ventures. The invisible legal architecture that makes global trade possible. And their relentless spirit of exploration, the daring voyages that took them around Africa and down its western coast, were not undertaken for glory or conquest, but for the fiercely practical purpose of opening new markets and finding new resources. This model of commercially driven exploration is the direct ancestor of the European Age of Discovery. Perhaps their most surprising and intimate legacy is a biological one, a secret they left behind in the DNA of the Mediterranean itself. For a long time, it was assumed that the Phoenicians, as a people, had been completely absorbed into later populations. But recent, large-scale genetic studies have told a different story. Scientists have identified a specific set of genetic markers on the Y chromosome that are strongly associated with the populations of the ancient Phoenician homeland in the Levant. When they mapped the distribution of these markers, they found a startling pattern. Not only do a significant percentage of men in modern coastal Lebanon carry this genetic signature, but the markers also appear at unusually high frequencies in a familiar string of pearls across the sea. In Cyprus, in Malta, in western Sicily, in southern Spain, and in Tunisia. The map of Phoenician DNA almost perfectly overlaps the map of their ancient colonial network. The evidence is clear. The Phoenicians were not wiped out. They settled, they integrated, and their ancestral lines continue to this day. A silent, biological testament to their travels. Their story is written not just in stone, but in the blood of the very lands they once connected. And so the long voyage of this ancient people finally comes to a quiet end. They were the great connectors, the weavers of the world. They were not great conquerors or grand philosophers, but they were the vital current that allowed ideas, goods, and people to flow, transforming isolated shores into a shared civilization. They braved the wrath of the sea, the terror of the unknown, and the rise and fall of brutal empires, surviving not through the sword, but through their wits, their resilience, and their unmatched understanding of the waves. Their story is a quiet one, often overshadowed by the louder histories of Rome and Greece, but it is a story of profound and enduring importance. As you now let go of the day and drift toward the peaceful shores of sleep, perhaps you can hear the faintest echo of their long passage. It is not a sound of trumpets or of battles, but a quieter, more gentle sound. The whisper of the wind in a cedar-colored sail. The quiet lapping of waves against the hull of a ship that has finally come home to a safe harbor after a long and weary journey. The cargo has been delivered. The ledgers are closed. Rest now. The long voyage is over. Sleep well,